Welcome, everybody. I realize it's very early. It's going to be a long day, and I hope as many of you as can will stay for the whole day. I'm Lawrence Weschler, the director of the New York Institute for the Humanities, and along with Eric Kleinenberg over here, the director of the Institute for Public Knowledge, we are convening this day of consideration about solitary confinement from various different angles. I thought I'd start just by telling you something about the picture you see here of the toilet from solitary confinement. If you look at it closely, you'll see that it's beaded. And it's the work of the artist Liza Liu, who some of you may know about. She began her career by spending 5 years beading every surface in a kitchen. Let's turn off that light because it's knocking that out. Can you see it okay? Spiro, we don't need the light on me at this point. But anyway, every surface, the water in the sink, the things, and then she went on from there to bead. That's good. From there, she went on to bead a backyard, including 1 million blades of grass. That got her a MacArthur. As well it should, I think. Then I'll just show you these again. More recently, though, in fact, after she got the MacArthur, she moved to South Africa and began working with Ndebele tribes women who have an incredible tradition of beading, and they began doing some South Africa-specific sorts of works, such as beading prison cages. You can see that's everything there is beaded, including the barbed wire, and prison walk, the sort of places where people are allowed to walk in South African prisons. That's where they get their exercise. Here she is working. And then one of her most amazing pieces, it seems to me, was she beaded an entire solitary cell. This was her response to the traditional white cube, gallery setting. This is, you want a white cube, I'll show you a white cube. And it was out of that she, in fact, it was part of that originally, but then she separated it out, that she made this toilet, which of course, in the tradition of modern art, Marcel Duchamp and so forth, is a loaded image. It's also, if you remember her name, Liza Liu, she calls it Liu, so it's a self-portrait. But for our purposes, it's an occasion to think about solitary. When we began thinking of this, and when I was talking to Eric and some of the people in his shop, we were thinking about the way in which there are right now, at this minute, 80,000 people in solitary confinement in the United States. That's probably a low projection. That is arguably, it's hard to find statistics for this sort of thing, but that is arguably more people in solitary confinement in the United States today than at any other place at any time in history. Another American exceptionalism to be proud of. But by contrast, in Canada, for example, there are 300 people in solitary confinement. And we were trying to figure out how to make this real for people and how to bring people, as I hope will begin to happen during the day, to a conversation about this who are not the usual suspects, who are not the people who go to all the ACLU things and so forth. And it occurred to me that one way to do it would be to invite a range of people, at least during the morning sessions, who are creative people of all sorts, people who work with insects, people who work, scientists, mosaicists, playwrights, monologists, and so forth, to talk about a fantasy which I think a lot of us have had at one time or another, about what we would do, how we would try to keep from going crazy if we were in solitary confinement. So we're going to do that for the first few hours. And we'll start in just a second, but I thought I would tell a story about how I first became obsessed with this topic. Many years ago, I was reporting for The New Yorker in Uruguay. There had been a terrible military regime there. There had been a wonderfully kind of zany group of radicals in the period before that called the Tupamaros. And the military regime crushed this group. You have to remember that Uruguay at that time was the single most democratic place in South America. It was often called the Switzerland of South America. It had a marvelous welfare state, apparatus, Social Security, all kinds of things. And then in the 60s, the Tupamaros rose up and began doing kind of antic radical things. And eventually the military cracked down very, very hard. And during the 10 years of military regime in Uruguay, there were more people per capita in prison there than any place in the world. Probably, I imagine the United States today has a higher rate. But in any case, some of the major people, the 7 top Tupamaros were separated out and subjected to a regime of solitary confinement for over 10 years each, scattered among remote military outposts and put in the bottom of wells with grates above them. And I had occasion, when I went down to Uruguay, to talk with one of them, this marvelous playwright named Mauricio Rosenkopf. And he had been out for about a year at that point, and I asked him how he kept from going crazy during that time. And he said, well, I guess as a playwright, I'm blessed with a vivid imagination. And so as often as possible, I would take long walks to the beach. And I would spend the whole day sunning myself, had to watch out not to get a sunburn. One time, it was a huge problem. I forgot to get rid of the Coke bottle on my way back and spent the next 24 hours in an agony of anxiety because I was afraid the guard looking down would notice the Coke bottle. And in fact, I had to sleep on top of the Coke bottle that night. And I woke up with a terribly strained back from having slept on this Coke bottle. Finally, I was able to take another walk to the beach, and I left it there the last time. I never made that mistake again. Then he told a story about, he told me that during the last 2 years of his incarceration, he had had a very, very intense intellectual relationship with a rooster who had wandered into his thing. And he told me about the conversations they'd had about Hegel and other subjects. He was a very smart rooster, he told me. I asked him whether the rooster had been real, and he said he didn't know. Anyway, with that as a backdrop, I thought we'd start today's proceedings by inviting Tony Kushner up to, and you and I can have a conversation. By the way, we're not giving introductions to anybody. That speeds things up, but also there are introductions here. You're confused who you are, but Tony Kushner is one of our great playwrights and the creator most recently of the screenplay for Lincoln. But so Tony, I guess my first question to you is, how do you respond to this story about Rosenkopf, and whether, I guess the question for you is, in some sense, do you think that as a playwright it would be easier for you or harder to?
You know, I read it when I read A Miracle.
Is this on? Can you hear him?
Oh, I didn't turn it on. I'll turn it on for you. Okay, is that, yeah. Is that on? It's on, okay. When I read A Miracle, the Universe, when it came out, whenever that was.
Yeah, about 1990 or so.
So yes, I remember that story very vividly, and then you sent it to me when we were talking about coming here, and it filled me with the same kind of panic that there was a guy next to Rosenkopf who went completely crazy and kept demanding that the guards bring him water and take him to the bathroom, and just be screaming and screaming and screaming and couldn't stop. That would absolutely, without any question, be me. I would not be the person with the rooster. I mean, it's interesting that he says as a playwright he has a vivid imagination. I don't know that I feel that I have a vivid imagination. I really like talking to people, which is what I think playwriting is really about. It's dialogue. And the idea of being deprived of that And I was incredibly relieved. I had forgotten that detail, that they gave him sort of out-of-date Scientific Americans to look at.
That was another one, yeah, one of the other guys, yeah.
And he, I guess,
Became a
learned enough
physicist.
physics from reading it to make some sense of it. I'm innumerate, so I don't know that I would have done me better, at least with pictures and words to look at. Otherwise, it's really something that all my life I've had intense nightmares about. So maybe that's
Nightmares,
why I'm here.
what sorts of nightmares?
Just of being buried alive or being stuck in solitary confinement. And every time I've come across, I was asked last year, I decided not to do it, to do a screenplay about the whole WikiLeaks Bradley Manning case. And although I have complicated feelings about Bradley Manning and what's-his-face and Julian Assange and the whole thing, I'm not an anarchist, and I think that it's there's a lot of unexamined nonsense from my comrades on the left about WikiLeaks. But and Bradley Manning seems to me to be, a person of who's in many ways in a lot of psychological trouble, was before he was arrested, but he's been in solitary confinement.
Let's keep that in mind through this whole day today, that if you want a face for the 80,000 people, we'll have a few here later on, but Bradley Manning is one of those people who has been in solitary confinement the whole time.
Right.
And entered exactly psychologically troubled to begin with.
Right, and it's clearly in some sense a form of torture, and really disturbingly, not even torture for any, ostensible, not that torture is good if you have a purpose, but there's really nothing that Bradley Manning at this point can be expected to tell anyone. He acted very much on his own. So there's a kind of a creepy feeling of just abusiveness. I don't know if he's still in solitary. As of the time that I was doing research, he absolutely was in and out, but was. And even though he was a person who, it seemed to me, had issues, he's apparently displayed this Rosenkopf's level of durability and strength. His psychic structures have, according to people who have talked to him, kind of remained intact. But it would be easy to imagine how that would just come completely.
It's striking when you say, two things that have just come out is my fantasy is that the playwright sits in a cube by himself and generates dialogues and so forth. But of course, one of the things you just pointed out is that in your case, and I think that's probably true of other playwrights, that in between the time that they sit in things by themselves, they go out and they talk to people, they try cadences out on people.
Well, you go into rehearsal, with honor sitting there. Poets, I admire them immensely. I think poetry is the greatest kind of writing, but I could never do it. I need to be, it's a difficulty facing playwrights because you then have to leave the rehearsal room. My friend George Wolfe says, it's time to leave the party and go back into your solitary again, but it's obviously not all that difficult kind of solitary, but you have to, the trick of it is to remain, I think, developing as a playwright is to be able to plunge into the incredibly gregarious world of rehearsals, and actors are just the best people in the world to hang around with. They're the most fun. I wouldn't marry one, but they're the most fun people on earth to be around, and then you have to go back and be alone, and so it's writing and it's not.
It occurs to me also that in a way it's like the dilemma of exiles who, when they are forced out of their native language, and the daily contact with their native language, which is to say the contact with other people, that it withers and it can be extremely dangerous.
Yeah, although I think that playwrights don't have a native language. We're amphibians. We're writers and not writers at the same time, and that's what I love about doing it. It's a very peculiar art form in that regard, because you never settle comfortably anywhere, and that's kind of a joy of it.
So talk a little bit more, though, about the anxiety of, well, obviously the anxiety of being buried alive, but the anxiety of being by yourself.
I think it's probably connected in some way to, or rather, the fear that I have about writing is probably connected to this. But there's a way in which I would imagine, you're forced into a direct confrontation with yourself with no possible distraction and with no assistance from interaction with other people. And it's a profoundly unnatural thing for any human being to be in complete isolation, because there's no such thing as a single human being. There's no such thing as an individual in one sense. We're so deeply connected. So it's profoundly moving, the story of the rooster. I don't think that you said in the book that the rooster, and he talked about Hegel.
Yeah, I missed that.
I think what you said in the book is just that there was a rooster that showed up at some point and he didn't know, which I found, and I imagine at some point you sort of stop caring. I think that it's any idea of being, when I've done, civil disobedience kind of things and getting arrested, it's always scary when you are in the clutches of somebody else and you realize that you really actually have been deprived of any kind of agency. I mean, you really, I've never been in jail for more than like a day, and but I've always found the idea of a long time forced to be alone really terrifying, because I think it would test something that I'm not confident would withstand the. I had Daniel Boyarin, who's a sort of he runs the Talmudic Studies department at UC Berkeley, and he's this wonderful. He's a rabbi, and when he was in the IDF in the Israeli army, he had to man an outpost in the desert. Where he would have to stand with a gun and stare out into the darkness in the desert for 8 hours, and his job was to stand there and stare out and not do anything else. So he started bringing books with him, and he would read, and he got caught several times, and they were threatening to court-martial him and put him in jail, and he had to get a psychiatrist to write a report saying that he had a mental illness. That if he didn't have a book to read, he would go crazy, and that sort of gave him a medical exemption from being on guard duty. But I talked to him about it, and he said that he really tried, but being without a book, just staring into the black, and that stayed with me as a kind of a vivid image of. When we were first talking about this, I mentioned. When I years ago got very interested in, and I still am interested in American anarchism as a radical left tradition, and I read the Prison Diaries of Alexander Berkman, who was Emma Goldman's lover, and a man who, after this incredibly vicious assault on striking workers, decided to assassinate Henry Clay Frick, and attacked him in his mansion. With a knife, and because Berkman wasn't really a violent man and wasn't very big either, he managed to stab Frick a couple of times in the leg and was put in Leavenworth prison for 17 years. I think it may have been a life sentence originally, but he finally got out after 17 years. But he spent, I don't remember how many years, I think the first 4 or 5, intermittently in solitary confinement. And begged Emma Goldman, and he got letters to her somehow through his lawyers, I think, to come to Kansas with cyanide capsules that she would smuggle in, and if he was allowed to meet with her, they would find a way to trade them, and that he could kill himself because he couldn't stand it. She 2 times, I think, took the train from New York to Kansas with the cyanide, and once made it all the way to Leavenworth, to the city near Leavenworth and Kansas City, and checked into a hotel. But both times turned around and came back, and she couldn't do it.
She was no better with the cyanide than he was with the knife.
She couldn't. She loved him, and she couldn't do it. And then Voltairine de Cleyre, who is this sort of somewhat forgotten figure, but who was an incredibly great. She was an anarchist writer, and kind of the Dionysian anarchist, as opposed to the Apollonian, to Emma Goldman's kind of positive revolutionary spirit. Voltairine is this very, very dark but just an astonishing writer, and was also in love with Berkman, who was very hot. And Voltairine said, "I'll do it," and she went all the way in and got into the room with Berkman, and then couldn't give them to him. one of the, this has nothing to do with solitary confinement, but
If that's just the opposite.
in the diaries, he writes very openly about the terrible stress on his soul, on his psyche of being in solitary. And then one of the things that makes the diary so extraordinary is that he writes about a physical relationship, a sexual relationship he had when he was let out of solitary with another prisoner. And even though he was heterosexual and was with Emma before he went into prison, and then when he got out, they had moved, they stayed friends, but he picked up with another woman. But he writes, and this thing was published, I think, in the early 1920s, and he writes very openly and says, if it hadn't been for this man, and not only for our friendship, but for the physical act of love, I would not have survived prison. I know I would have found some way to kill myself. And it's, I mean, he was really one of the great
It sounds like something
people.
that's percolating for a play.
Well, I mean, the other thing that we talked about, I bought this thing. The last play that I wrote, The Intelligent Homosexual's Guide to Capitalism and Socialism with the Key to the Scriptures, which was at the Public Theater last May. The main character is a fictional relative of Vito Marcantonio, the 6-time radical congressman from East Harlem, who died of a heart attack in the 50s. And this guy is a made-up cousin of his who lives in a brownstone in Brooklyn and is a longshoreman who won the guaranteed annual income in a dock workers strike in the early 70s. So he hasn't actually worked as a longshoreman, and he's now retired from not working. And in the immense amount of free time that he's had collecting the guaranteed income that they won in the strike, he's taught himself Latin and has been translating the epistles of Horace. And the play is about his decision. He had attempted suicide at 71, the year before the play begins, and then at 72, he calls his 3 adult children back to the family brownstone. It's something that his grandfather, a stevedore from Italy, managed somehow to scrape up enough money to buy. He calls them back to tell them that he's decided that he's going to do it, and he's worked out how to do it this time. He had tried cutting his wrists before. And this is I translated, with what I remember from high school Latin, Horace's epistle. It's epistle 16 from the first book of Horace's epistles. And it's like most of them, it goes all over the place. There are themes that tie various things together. It's an everything that Horace did was. And after talking a lot about rich people and poor people and making some very salient points about the problem about being rich and how it undoes you, at the end of the epistle, he says, Horace writes, the good man, the wise man, is brave enough to say, as the disguised god said in Euripides' play The Bacchae, which is actually not in Horace. I added that line because I think that's what he's talking about. Pentheus, king of Thebes, again, in Horace, he's not identified. What terrible things can you do to me? Because the disguised god is Dionysus, and he's in Pentheus' prison. And Pentheus says, I'll take everything you have. My cattle, you mean? My farm, my possessions and bank account? Take them. And Pentheus says, and I'll shackle you hand and foot and hand you over to a sadistic jailer. And then this prisoner replies, God will free me as soon as I ask him to. And in the Bacchae, of course, that's what Dionysus said, but he is God. Mm-hmm. And as soon as he's decided that he's had enough of these games with Pentheus, the prison just completely collapses and vines sprout out of the rock. But what Horace writes is, God will free me as soon as I ask him to. What the character's saying is, I'll die. That's my understanding. And then it's great. The last line is always death. That may be cheating. In the Latin, it's opinor hoc sentit moriar, I can die. Mors ultima linea rerum est. so it actually is the last line is death. I don't know if in ancient Rome a line meant a line in a play, but I thought that was a kind of good fun. And this is a man who he's a longshoreman. He's also been a member of the Communist Party. He's from a family of Italian radicals. And his grandfather was an anarchist. His father was a communist. He's a communist, and he was an organizer for the party all his life. And he left the party after the Cleveland Convention in the early 90s and the collapse of Gus Hall and all that stuff, and then came back. He rejoined after 9/11. It's it's an ideology and a home for him, but it's also become a prison for him. He feels completely isolated, and I know a number of old communists who feel this way. I mean, really bewildered and abandoned by history and by the world. And he's learned this dead language that nobody can speak anymore, and ultimately is choosing to die. I mean, he says to his daughter when he finally sits down and explains, the first thing that he says is that when he was young and reading Marx, he could see the world as this extraordinary web of systems and interconnections, and could understand that if you just readjusted things slightly, you could upset a balance that had been put into place with great violence, and a new kind of violent force could be released in the readjusting, which could change the configuration in the direction of justice and the possibility of life for most people as opposed for only a very few. And that has slowly died out, and that he feels this terrible isolation, but that he knows he has a means of in a sense, affecting his own as a revolutionary action, as a way of refusing imprisonment, as a way of and if you can't change the world outside, you change the world inside. And so I got very interested in communists who committed suicide. And also Louis Althusser, who committed murder. But the connection between issues of revolution and self-destruction and this feeling of isolation. So.
I know you have to leave in a minute, but why don't you stay there, because I want you to hear the poem that Alistair's going to read, and then I'll have a question for you. But Alistair, can you come and join us? This is Alistair Reid. Apart from anything else, he's one of the foremost translators of Borges.
Well, we're not going to.
Can you do it here? Is that okay?
You have the poem here.
I have it here for you.
Thank you.
And would you rather sit down?
No, well, you're talking.
No.
Go on talking.
Okay. Well, okay. While they mic Alistair up, this is a poem by, Alistair will describe it, but he and a Mexican poet got together and chose 50 poems each of English and Spanish, and then translated them together for, I believe, 2 months in Guadalajara. And
you get everything wrong.
Oh, well, there you go.
That was 1 month in
Cuernavaca. See, 1 month, that's what I said.
well,
Alistair, you of all people. But anyway, so we've handed out this poem, and we need one up here. I want to show Tony as well. So since I get it wrong, you explain it.
well, I'd like to say a little thing first about solitude. Seeing the word solitary in huge letters terrifies me all the time, because we're used to dealing with living in time, and solitary means the absence of time. I first found this during the war. I served in the British Navy in the Far East, and stationed in Ceylon, as it was called then. And we used to put to sea in a very small boat, a frigate with about 70 of a ship's company with no orders at all. We were sent to sea. We were never told where we were going or for how long, and we were put to sea for something like 30 days without having any, there was no time. We were suspended at sea, and I found it one of the most frightening times, never having anything in view. And this is the real meaning of solitary, to be deprived of time, to be deprived of any expectation. And as a matter of fact, after, when the war ended, we were sent to the Persian Gulf to continue this thing, and someone was inspired enough to give the ship a movie projector, which came on board with only one film, and it was National Velvet. Elizabeth Taylor's greatest role, which she was in love with a horse, and we showed it and showed it again and again and again and again, and when we'd all seen it at least 26 times and knew the dialogue by heart, then the electrician who showed it backwards. And believe me, it began with Elizabeth Taylor riding in the Grand National, winning, being given a cup, and then getting up on a horse awkwardly and running over fence after fence backwards, joined at everyone by more and more horses. And it ended with Mickey Rooney walking backwards down a long road, getting smaller and smaller and disappearing. And this did very little for our solitude, believe me. And this business has continued all the time. The terror of being deprived even of time. And although we complain as writers always about time, which is the main subject of being a writer, I think, dealing with time, to have time taken away from you is to be left completely in isolation. And this is where the imagination comes into play. Then the real equivalent, I've never experienced solitary confinement, but I have done a great deal of solitary translation, which is very close to this experience of solitary confinement. To be alone with a text in another language and a dictionary as the only company you have, and to wrestle with a poem in one language, trying to bring it up to snuff in another language. However, there are compensations, and one of the few compensations, is the poem that Ren has asked me to read. It's by a Mexican poet called Juan Carvajal, a very whimsical poet who's unfortunately died 12 or 15 years ago. The poem is called 1,001 Nights, and I will read it to you. Pura and I each did these translations together in Cuernavaca. She knows English very well, and we had very amusing conversations about the poems as we were translating them. And here is the poem, 1,001 Nights. I told the genie of the lamp, I have only one wish for now. I would like, before dying, to see the aurora borealis and hear the music that precedes its coming. Sorry, I'm going to read off the print, which is clearer. I told the genie of the lamp, I have just one wish for now. I would like, before dying, to see the aurora borealis and hear the music that precedes its coming. Gallop with the Tartars across the infinite plains of Mongolia. Be shipwrecked for nights and days, lashed to a flimsy plank. Wake up in a forest full of water nymphs. Be a camel driver in Isfahan and a prince in Istanbul, both in the same day. Spend the entire night lost in the Congo and find a magic plant. Cross the Gobi Desert alone and map it precisely. Be a schoolmaster in a hamlet in Siberia. Travel with my favorite whale, either inside or outside. Be a man condemned to death against the wall or in the chair. Be the Pope in Rome by day and a whore in Singapore at night. Feast on a missionary with my tribe in Zimbabwe. Be the richest man in the world and the most depraved. Live like a Khandala in Bombay. Be a black poet burning on the crosses of the Ku Klux Klan. Be the Grand Master of the Klan. Live in a lover's colony on a coral island. Paint a masterwork about nothing at all. Have a harem with Kim Basinger grossly deformed. Be the mother of 20 illegitimate sons. Live as an ascetic in the Sinai and discover there is no God. Own a palace of marble and live in a hovel. See Earth from another galaxy. Do lascivious things to delight an inflexible queen. Be a boy with a kite on the slope of the Andes. Be offensive to God and know that he felt terrible. Comfort him and make up both of us happy. Be a benevolent tyrant in a most fertile kingdom. Be a trapeze artist and recite poems in the air. Call myself Ashaveras. Be a cobra with its dark wisdom, its poison. Meet myself in the street and follow me. See me as the one who hates me sees me, as she who loves me sees me at the peak of love. Converse with Plato in his gardens. Make love on a chestnut horse at full gallop. Invent an unimaginable shocking flower and bird. Feel what that man was feeling that night in Gethsemane. Know all the seaports of the world. Tell them by smell. Marry the most beautiful woman in the planet and be extremely poor together. Be a salamander and live in the fire. Later, I'll tell you my other 2 wishes.
Thank you so much, Alex. So, that's an alternate way of spending time.
That was extraordinary.
It reminds me, you've got to get going, but your story about the rabbi on guard duty, and this for that matter as well, reminds me of a great poem of Thomas Tranströmer's called Guard Duty, where it's a great poem, I don't have it with me, but he talks about being on guard duty and on the Finnish border, because everybody's drafted in Sweden and they have to do guard duty, like for what, you know? But at one point it says, task to be where I am. Even in this solemn and absurd role, I am still the place where creation does a little work on itself.
That's beautiful.
But anyway, well, listen, you got to get going, but thank you so much for
Sure,
coming.
my pleasure. I wish I could stay for the whole day.
Okay,
Anyway.
thank you. And Alistair, again, thank you. That was just terrific. Joshua, are you around? Yeah. I'll put this down. Joshua 4 will give us another, he's going to get mic'd up.
Sorry? Oh, sure.
I asked Joshua here because, as you know, he at one point was the U.S. memory champion and trained himself, as his book Outside
Hi.
details. He trained himself in some of the great memory traditions, and maybe that would be something you could do in solitary. But give us your thoughts.
Thank you.
No, I'm not.
So
Is it
in
your play, or?
No, it's a meme. It was written like.
Oh,
in
there's
1900s.
somebody. We got to get his thing.
It's the first play written in English.
Is that the voice of
Tony's
God?
still on.
I thought you might be.
Oh, it was Kushner. It was the voice of God. Yeah. Yeah, okay. So, thank you. At some point in, I think it was either late 2006 or early 2007, I don't actually remember exactly when, I had the privilege of spending a day with a woman who is known in the medical literature as AJ. And she was the first person ever diagnosed with this newly identified condition called hyperthymestic syndrome, superior autobiographical memory. She could remember something, not everything, but at least one thing, that occurred on every day of her life since childhood. Now, human memory is not supposed to work like this, right? Most of us forget most of our lives as fast as we lead them. And the question for neuroscientists was, how do we explain this extraordinary woman? How do we explain her extraordinary memory? And what is the difference between her and the rest of us? Or is there one? So until relatively recently, most psychologists actually believed that we hold in our minds, in our memories, a perfect recording of everything that's ever happened to us. Every smell we encounter, every feeling, every touch, every word we utter gets stored away in our cerebral attic. And if we can't find those memories, it's simply because we've lost the key to the filing cabinet, not because those memories have actually been erased. And this misguided belief, which I don't think most psychologists now subscribe to, basically goes back to an experiment that was conducted, a set of experiments from the 1930s to the 1950s by a Canadian neurosurgeon named Wilder Penfield, sorry. And he was operating on epileptic patients, trying to identify the source of their epilepsy. He had their skulls open on the operating table while they were still awake, and he would touch different parts of their brain with an electrical probe. And he found that when he would touch areas of the temporal lobe in particular, he would elicit what seemed like long-forgotten memories. You know, people talking about trading desserts during lunchtime in second grade, that sort of thing. And when he would touch that same part of the brain, he would get the same memory elicited. And so people came to believe that perhaps he was accessing these long-forgotten memories. In the 1980s, the early 1980s, a Dutch psychiatrist named Willem Wagner conducted a kind of incredible experiment. He spent 6 years trying to record in detail his entire life. So every day, at the end of the day, he'd take a set of index cards and write down every salient thing that had happened to him on that day, who he had been with, where he had been, what exactly had transpired. And at the end of those 6 years, he went back and wanted to see how much of his life he had in fact remembered. And what he found was that of the more recent events, he remembered just about everything. And as he went farther back in time, he remembered less and less. And of those events that happened in the first year of the experiment, he remembered about 80%. But here's what's really amazing. He took the index cards from the events that he couldn't remember, and he went back to the people who were listed on those cards as having been present at those events. And he said to them, help me out. Give me something that you remember from that event, and let's see if it cues my memory. And he found that, in fact, with the right set of cues, he was able to remember every single event that had happened to him on those cards. Now, we don't know how much of our lives we are actually capable of remembering. Nobody's ever performed that experiment of trying to recall their entire lives. Nobody's ever performed the experiment because if you were going to do it, if you were going to try and remember everything that had happened from your first memory to the present moment, it would consume the rest of your life from the present moment onward. It's an experiment nobody could ever possibly conduct, unless perhaps you found yourself confined to solitary confinement in that condition. And so I think that's what I would spend my time in solitary confinement doing, trying to figure out exactly how much of my life I could remember. And I thought about how I might do this, and what I think I would do is I'd start with a set of index cards, like that Dutch psychologist, and simply try and spill out as many memories as I could. Probably have to empty out an entire Staples to have enough index cards. And I think over time, that process would stop bearing fruit, and so I would move on to stage 2. Now, we know that our memories are associational by nature, that we can go from the Milky Way to milk to white to berry white. That's a short neurological jump. And so what I would do is I'd start taking the index cards of the things that I had remembered, and I'd start using them to cue myself. Okay, here's my memory of my 5th birthday party at Putt-Putt in Rockville, Maryland, and I remember that Chloe Thompson was there. And I remember now that in 5th grade, I kissed Chloe Thompson in a game of Spin the Bottle, and that was at Nick Sadowski's house. And Nick Sadowski ended up going to the Naval Academy, and now I remember a trip to Annapolis and so on and so forth. And I think I could spend a few more years using that process to help dredge up more memories, throwing these fishing hooks into my memory and seeing what I can pull back out. And I think eventually I would exhaust that process, and I'd move on to step 3, when I would start asking the guard on the other side of the door for random words. Bourbon, sunglasses, necktie. And I'd start using those to go fishing again. And I think I'd end up with this big stack of index cards, and I'd probably like to start then putting them in chronological order and overlaying the structure of the calendar on top of them and seeing if maybe I can fill in every day of my life. It's a kind of quixotic dream. Now, turns out AJ, after she came to light, we discovered about 24 other people who had this extraordinary condition, hyperthymustic syndrome. And when scientists went and sort of started looking at what these people all had in common, they found basically one thing, one trait that they all shared. And that is, they all had, to some degree or another, obsessive-compulsive disorder. And I saw this very clearly when I got a chance to spend time with AJ. It turns out she is an obsessive diarist. She writes in the tiniest little handwriting on a calendar everything that happened to her every day. She goes online, she prints out the weather every morning, and then files them away, those printouts in binders that line her house. And every morning when she wakes up, when she's blow drying her hair, she thinks back on what she did on that day a year ago, on what she did on that day 2 years ago, on that day 3 years ago, 4 years ago. She's constantly revising her life in her memory. And what this suggests is that perhaps what's extraordinary about this woman is not her memory, but rather this compulsion to remember. And I think if I were to find myself in solitary confinement, I suspect it would confirm the old truism that the only life we live is the life that we remember. And if that's true, then that raises a question. Of all the things that you could be obsessive about trying to hold on to, trying to remember your own life is maybe not the craziest thing. And perhaps it's not AJ who is mad, but the rest of us. Thank you.
Stay there. Go over there. keep that. Good. You're good. Oh.
Take it with me.
Oh, actually, I'm going to talk to him for a few seconds. Okay. Of course, one of the problems with being in solitary is they don't give you index cards.
Oh, that kind of solitary. Shoot.
And I also wonder to what extent what you're talking about, this obviously gets, your book is all about this, but is whether you're remembering your life or you're remembering what you remember remembering, or whether you...
Sure, I'm sure. We know that I would be filling those index cards with false memories, because every time we reactivate a memory, we don't just dredge it up, pull it out of a safety deposit box and look at it and then put it back in. We pull it back up in the light of who we are at that moment. and who we are at that moment when we're recalling that memory is different.
It's the Guadalajara-Cuernavaca problem. We had it, yeah.
Yeah, we're different than we were at the last time we recalled that memory. And the memory takes on a new inflection based on who we are at that moment. And so we're changing. Our memories are constantly mutating as we ourselves are constantly mutating.
It's interesting because I was thinking that something that you might do if you were in solitary would be memory exercises or something.
Yeah, I already did that though. I wrote a book about it.
Right.
Got moved on.
Okay, but describe what that might be like. Again, if you were, it's not. It won't be you. You aren't the person who's written that book. But is that a thing that you could do to try? Again, you're trying to keep from going crazy.
Right.
Although, frankly, when you were doing that, I think you were going crazy, actually. But
Yeah. I mean, so it's funny. The guy who is kind of the main character of my book, and who was my coach, took me under his wings and taught me all these ancient memory tricks. He said that to me at one point that his measure of, that he would like to be the kind of person who could spend 10 years in solitary confinement. Those were his actual words, without going crazy, because he has stocked away so much good stuff in his memory. So many poems, so many great stories, that he could sit there with his eyes closed and reread the Iliad, which he had in fact memorized, or Paradise Lost, which he had in fact memorized. But you'd have to kind of, he's spending his whole life prepping for solitary confinement, and I haven't done that.
But let's keep going. Could you, in a white room, kind of do tricks to memory gymnastics, set yourself challenges?
Yeah, but what would your input be? What would you be memorizing?
Well, that's the question. So what could you do? Again, I'm trying to push you on this fantasy. You just got arrested.
Yeah.
And there you are, you of all people, who do have these techniques.
Yeah. Well, I suppose we could ask the whisper to the guard and ask him for things to remember and commit those to memory. But I mean, again.
Or you could whisper to yourself. I mean, you could.
I suppose that's true. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what I was talking about doing just now was a kind of retrospective memory, as opposed to what I think you're asking me about.
Which is, could you try to remember Hamlet's soliloquy and struggle piece by piece, assuming that at some point you've read it,
right?
To be or not to be, and so forth.
Yeah.
Would your memory tricks be able to help you dredge it out of your head, or not?
I don't think so. I think it's gone. That's actually my honest belief. I think I've forgotten most of what I learned in high
Penfield
school.
could not push little buttons in your head and make
Well,
you
what
go?
Penfield was actually eliciting was more like hallucinations than authentic memories. That I think is what we would now say. Something more like déjà vu than actual long lost memories. So I'm skeptical that I'd be able to pull back Hamlet. Sorry to disappoint.
No. Well, listen, we have a few minutes here before we start the next session. We can have questions from the audience and also for Alistair over there. But yeah, go ahead.
It would seem to me
Loud.
It would seem to me that in order to remember Hamlet, you would have had to perform some kind of art of memory on it. You would have had to memorize it,
Right.
in the first place.
Right.
Right?
That's what I was saying. Yeah.
Right.
You'd have to have prepped.
So that's interesting. So that in other words, what you're saying about the memory is that even though you've read it twice and it is there somewhere, but when you say it's gone, it's gone.
Yeah, well, we now know that forgetting is an actual, that's something that happens at the cellular level in the brain.
Right.
Forgetting is real.
Right.
It's not simply the case that we've lost access to the filing cabinet. Some of the files have actually disappeared.
And thank God they have, otherwise there wouldn't be room for anything else.
Otherwise, we would be crazy, which is one interpretation of AJ's condition.
Yeah. Right.
There's really good reasons why we forget and why we don't remember everything that happens to us.
Other things, let's see, but loud.
Would your memory techniques or just trying to remember everything not prevent you from living the now?
I think it would, but I'm not sure what the now would be if you were in solitary confinement.
No, I'm just curious about your book and your research. what would the purpose be of trying to remember the things that have happened to you?
Well, if you were talking, I mean, I think there's a great argument to be made for trying to remember things that are happening to you right now, and that requires, I mean, okay. So the main reason we don't remember things is because we're not paying attention, and I think that if you can keep that thought in mind, that I'm going to be the kind of person who is constantly reminding myself to remember, remembering to remember, that's a good way to move through the world, and it's a good way to have a more memorable life, but also to be more present.
And that in itself, talking about presence in solitary, that would be a conundrum right there. How do you remember what's happening day to day when nothing's happening day to day?
Yeah, so actually, I should have spoken about this instead. I had an opportunity to interview a guy named Michel Siff, who is a French chronobiologist, guy who studies the science of time and its effect on organisms. And he conducted one of the most extraordinary self-experiments in the history of science. He had himself lowered into a cave. He did this actually on several occasions. He had himself lowered into a cave for, I think it was like 6 months, without access to light, no access to a calendar, no watch. And he wanted to know what this would do to his sense of time. And what happened, what he found very quickly, was that his memory was the first thing to go. Without the day to structure his life, it became impossible to remember what had happened a day ago, what had happened a month ago. He also found that his sense of time's passage had dramatically changed. So there was some date when he was supposed to, when he was called down from the surface, experiments up, time to come upstairs. He had been keeping a diary, and what he found when he went up to ground level was he had thought it was, August 12th. In fact, it was October 18th. His sense of time's passing had collapsed by a dramatic factor. And I think that is something that would happen to anybody in solitary confinement without all that input, right? It is our memories that structure our experience of time's passage. And the more of those landmarks, the more of those chronological landmarks we're able to have in our life, the more slowly time seems to pass. And that is a pretty good case for not living the kind of life that is day to day, exactly the same thing happening to you over and over again. You're sitting in a cubicle, you're doing the same thing. You should be taking vacations, you should be going and doing exciting things and having new experiences, not just because those are worthwhile things to do, but because the more you can pack your life with those kinds of chronological landmarks that we use to reference ourselves in relation to the passage of time, the longer our lives will actually subjectively feel.
I mean, it's interesting that we talk about wasting our lives, but it's worth in this context saying that as a body politic, we are laying waste to the lives of 80,000 people right now.
Yeah.
And we are actively wasting them, and something to think about whether we want to keep doing that. Anyway, thank you so much. One thing I want to say, by the way, is that we're going to continue on to the next section, and we'll take a break in an hour. But when we take a break, there are books outside. Those of you who've been at my things know I do this. This is free. That is an independent bookstore, McNally Jackson. They are the soul of our country. And we are going to lay them waste if we don't support them. So when we're finished here, I expect every one of you to buy books of these great people who are doing all this for free too. So anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you.
So this section, the first section was kind of poets and playwrights and memory people. This next section for about an hour, we're going to talk to some scientists and bug people and mathematicians and so forth. And I assure you the highlight of the day is going to happen in this next section toward the end of it. But so don't go away. But anyway, I want to start with Stuart Firestein, who is here he's the head of biology at Columbia, but he also I asked him what he would do in Solitaire, and here he is to tell us. Stuart Firestein.
Thank you. Thank you, Ren and Stephanie, for organizing this remarkable thing. I apologize. I'm sure all of you saw that I came in a bit late. I managed to miss the entire first part of the morning session, and all I can say is that all the usual excuses apply. Way too long to enumerate. So Ren asked me to do this a couple of weeks ago, and of course my first response, as I think many people's first responses to the idea of solitary, is they mix it up, I think, with solitude, with notions of solitude which have a much nicer connotation. So the first thing, if you're a busy person sort of thing, and too much in the world, as it were, thank you. This is fine. Is that you think, oh, solitary. Well, that might be nice for a little while. Maybe I'll get, the cell phone will stop ringing off and the emails will stop pinging and so forth. But then I realized that I regularly catch myself in the urinal checking my email. So really, how much do I want to be away from this email? I've even given up the toilet as a solitary place. And I think many of us do this as well. So really, maybe this idea is not quite so positive as we might at first think. To maybe reinforce that a little bit, I not intentionally, I went online to a few of these sort of quote sites, brainy quotes or fascinating quotes or this, that. So I figured I'd find some interesting quote about solitary or even solitude, perhaps, that would be interesting to use. And what's remarkable is that I found that every one of the quotes is very positive. They're all in this kind of Ralph Waldo Emerson kind of idea of solitary. The rugged individual, the solitary man, the this, the that. But I couldn't find a negative quote about solitary, which I found sort of surprising. So I think this is maybe a kind of a mindset that we have that's interesting to think about, at least. So my remit here today is talk about the neuroscience of solitary, which we don't know much, but I'll tell you a little bit of what we do know. It's not my field in particular, but I know people who work in it, and I know some of the literature about it as well. Certainly, one of the hotter areas of neuroscience now is evolutionary psychology and cognitive neuroscience, areas that have been ignored for years but are kind of very strong now. And one of the clear findings, I think, from this work is that there's every indication that the significant expansion of the human brain, the size of the brain that we have, and its evolution into this size is highly dependent upon the fact that we became at some point a highly social, highly communicative animal. And that vast amounts of brain space are used to read social cues, to be social, to talk, of course, which is a social activity, and to participate in all these things, and that we find them rewarding as well. That being social is rewarding, that flirting is one of the more rewarding behaviors we do, it turns out. That assembling like this, let's remember that assembling is guaranteed to us by the framers of the Constitution, so the notion of being together in a group and the possibility of doing so. So these are all rather rewarding kinds of things, and we, in fact, I could give you some spiel about dopamine flooding the brain when we do this and all that, but it's not so important, I think, at this point. But except to recognize that we understand sociality and communication and being with people as being highly rewarding. Of course, if it's rewarding, then withdrawing it is likely to be punishing. And I think this is clearly something that's been recognized for centuries by jailers and wardens, even by societies as a whole, with things like ostracism and the effects that this can have on a person, on an individual personality. So clearly it's used purely as punishment in that sense. There's an interesting history, I suppose, in neuroscience of studies of solitary or sociality, beginning with, I think, something that we all call the forbidden experiment. The forbidden experiment is actually grew up in the linguistic area. There was the idea that are we born with language? Do we have some innate kind of language thing in us? Or do we learn it, or are we acculturated by it? The whole nature versus nurture idea of things, which may be a false dichotomy, but nonetheless has driven scientific inquiry and behavior and in neuroscience for quite some time. And so the idea of the forbidden experiment, of course, is what if you took a child from birth and raised it in a deprived condition, raised it in solitude with no human contact, with minimal sensory input. What would this child have when you finally decided to test this child at 14 or 15 years of old, 14, 15 years of age? Would they be able to speak? Would they have any cultural abilities? Would they be able to see faces, understand friendly versus non-friendly? All of these things that we kind of take for granted, but we don't know whether they're innate or whether they're culture or which part of them is which or how much is which. So of course, as is the case with every forbidden experiment, it's almost surely been done, if not published. And there are cases of it where it's been done maybe on purpose or maybe accidentally. Historically, the most famous one, I guess, is that of Caspar Hauser. What's his name made a film of this?
Herzog.
Herzog, sorry, yes. So Herzog made a film of the story, and it's a reasonably well-documented story of a young boy found in the town square of Nuremberg in the mid-1800s with a note pinned to him asking him to please take care of him. And eventually he learned rudimentary language and some social skills, but he was always not quite right, as you might imagine. And it came out that he'd been raised in some sort of a basement somewhere, that he never saw another human being, that food appeared when he was asleep. They would occasionally cut his hair, apparently, but that was it. And he had a couple of toys around and no more. And of course, he grew up to be quite damaged as a personality. The story gets a little more bizarre in the end as he was murdered for some unknown reason somewhat later in life. There's a whole intrigue thing that goes on about it, not so important. A more recent case of this was the case of Jeannie, the young girl in Southern California that was written up by Russ Reimer, first as a New Yorker article and appears now as a book, which I recommend highly. It's quite fascinating. Jeannie was brought up in these deplorable conditions of having no contact and so forth, and was damaged as a personality through the rest of her life. There are animal experiments that have gone on in this area, the most famous or infamous being those of Harry Harlow and the rhesus monkeys, in which young monkeys were raised without a mother, but just given a sort of a wire frame version of another monkey, and these monkeys are damaged for life by having this kind of rearing condition. We don't even do those experiments on animals anymore, let alone on people. Of course, these were developmental experiments, and so we know that solitary conditions in a developing brain are disastrous and produce lifelong personality deficits, as well as all sorts of other deficits. I think we're less clear what happens to them in the adult brain. It's harder to understand this. Of course, one can't do experiments, even though we, in some unofficial way, are doing experiments by keeping people in solitary confinement. But clearly, it's damaging, and it remains damaging in the same way that post-traumatic stress syndrome does. And there are things that you would never be able to get over. The brain changes. It remains plastic throughout life. We should remember that the brain doesn't stop developing at birth, but develops at least through your mid-20s, maybe a little bit longer. And then it begins developing probably in the other way. I mean, as it goes downhill as you pass that age. But in any case, it remains plastic throughout your life. Plastic, is a kind of a jargony word that we use in neuroscience, which means actually moldable, that it can be changed. It's a changeable thing. It's not set in stone, as it were. And so clearly there must be effects, especially on a prison population that's primarily younger, that's often in precisely that crucial developmental time point for brain in the late teens and early 20s, all the way through, say, 30 years of age. Other experiments that have gone on in neuroscience, of course, are sensory deprivation, made, I guess, originally famous by John Lilly in the 1960s as sensory deprivation tanks, in which people would go into a tank of body temperature water suspended in the high salt content, so you were suspended, it felt gravity-free, there was no light, there was no sound, and so forth. And, of course, people would begin to hallucinate almost immediately within several minutes. It become highly hallucinatory. These were the same people that were screwing around with LSD and the like, so it wasn't necessarily considered a negative, but it clearly would be over a longer period of time. and this notion that it becomes hallucinatory is quite interesting. I personally believe, and I'm not quoting any particular research because I don't know any done in this area, but I believe we'll begin to find that the kind of hallucinations that you have mentally in a solitary or solitude sort of place are not so different in the end from that of phantom limbs. So I'm sure you're all familiar with situations where somebody loses an arm or something like that, but they continue to feel the arm as being there, often being twisted or moved in funny positions. And this is generally believed to be because the brain, of course, expects input from the nerves in the arm, and when it doesn't get it, it makes it up. So it essentially hallucinates an arm that's not there. Interestingly, almost all phantom limb type hallucinations are painful. Why that has to be, I'm not clear on, of course, but the brain generally, it seems, interprets inappropriate signals as being painful. This would somehow or another make, I guess, sense, but only in a post hoc kind of way. So it wouldn't be surprising then that the kind of hallucinations, mental hallucinations, psychic hallucinations that could develop out of solitary would be painful in that psychic kind of way as well. I believe that there would be a connection there, or a connection worth at least sort of looking for. Of course, another kind of solitary that shows up in neuroscience or neurology is something called locked-in syndrome. This is a rare but devastating pathology of the brain in which, usually due to some sort of a massive stroke or occasionally an injury or a progressive debilitating disease, a person becomes more and more, as it were, locked into their head. That is, they lose all ability to control their muscles. They have no behavior, but they're there in their head. There's no cognitive deficit particularly. They can't do anything except maybe blink an eye. For example, a recent example of this was the French, what's his name, slipped through my head, the butterfly and the diving bell. Yes, what was his name? I can't, it just went right out of my head. That'll come back. Yes. Yes, anyway, so that was one example. Also quite an interesting film was made of it, and he managed to write the book, of course, but literally by blinking one eye. That's all he had left. But there was a mind in there, and yet he was in some ways completely cut off and in some solitary situation. I was at a meeting recently where Stephen Hawking was there, the great physicist, and he's very, very close to being in this situation. So over the years, this progressive, some form of ALS that he seems to have, although it's not clear what the actual disease is, but it continues to progress to the point where he really can do very little but move his cheek. And so he has a sensor on his cheek that kind of runs a computer, but he knows that's on its way out as well and will be locked in. And he's otherwise completely mentally healthy, but is more and more detached. And you can see that there's, he's very open about the fear of this happening finally, of his being locked in. Let me sort of finish this with a sort of an unscientific, that is, it was a survey not done scientifically, but a survey that was done by one of the National Institutes of Health, the NIDCD. This is the National Institute of Deafness and Other Communicative Disorders. I happen to know about this survey in a quirky kind of way because the National Institutes of Health, which funds most scientific research, biological life sciences research, and most neuroscience research in this country, is organized around diseases because we all think we should be paying for them to cure diseases. In point of fact, they support a great deal of basic fundamental research as well. But nonetheless, the institutes are all named after diseases. So there's the National Eye Institute, National Cancer Institute, et cetera, et cetera. And my laboratory, it so happens, works on the olfactory system. The sense of smell is a kind of a window onto the brain and its functions. And so we're covered by an institute called the National Institute on Deafness and Other Communicative Disorders, which is a kind of a, I don't know what you call it. It's a phrase that's intentionally maybe not so obvious, but it covers all the other sensory systems except the eyes, because vision has its own institute. But of course we call it deafness because that's the one with the greatest pathology. There's not much pathology, serious pathology associated with loss of your sense of smell. Although people comply, that's another rant for another time. So in any case, these institutes compete against each other to some extent for a chunk of the total NIH budget. And so they're always looking to get their patient base to be the most injured in some way or another, and the most strenuously lobbying Congress and so forth. So the National Institute of Deafness and Communicative Disorders ran a survey in which they asked questions of both blind people and deaf people. And it was a lengthy survey, but the final basis of it, the final question more or less was, they would ask blind people if, given the possibility of regaining their sight but losing their hearing, would they make that trade-off? And remarkably, the answer turned out to be almost 100% no. No. Now you might say, well, because I'll take what I have, I don't want to go somewhere I'm not, I don't know what that is, I've learned to be blind, so I'll be blind. But it turned out that when the same question, but in reverse, was asked of people who were deaf, that is, if you could get your hearing back, would you give up your sight? Their answer was yes. Almost, again, 100%. Because deafness, they felt, cut them off from human contact. They were not part of the social fabric. They couldn't partake in conversations normally. They couldn't go to a party and be part of things. Whereas blindness for them was, although a disability, but one that you could work around. But deafness cuts you off. I think we see this regularly, and we don't take enough note of it in the geriatric population, where as you lose hearing, the major complaint of older people is they no longer feel a part of things. They'll sit in the room with the family, but they're not in the conversation. They can't hear well enough, and so they're out of it somehow or another. And I think this notion speaks very strongly to the idea of being in solitary, of being separated from the kind of input, the social input that comes from just simple contact. But of course, speech is one way, and hearing and so forth and so on. But I think it's just indicative of the crucial importance of contact to the brain in general. I mean, many animals are this way, but certainly to the human brain. And I think personally, we should be very careful about depriving a brain of this before we understand what it means to not have it. Thank you.
Thank you. Catherine, will you take you a few minutes to set up, or you set up? Are you?
Do I have to adjust the sound?
Okay. Well, just one second.
yeah.
While she's setting up,
Okay.
in a second we're going to have how you could befriend a bug. But while she's setting up, I was just going to ask you a question.
Sure.
I know that if you mentioned this in passing, that you would have to go through incredible protocols to do experiments on human beings nowadays, especially the forbidden experiment.
Especially.
Would you even be able to go through a protocol to do experiments on people in solitary? You've got 80,000 of them there. It would be great to do experiments on those people. Or would you be forbidden to do it? Is it so bad that you would be forbidden to do it?
I'm really shocked to even hear you suggest this in a way. Yes, I think it would. Well, I mean, the fact that you already, of course, there's always the slippery slope of, gee, if this research gets interesting, then, we'll slip the warden another $50 and throw somebody else in solitary because we need to increase the number of subjects. So that would be one reason why I think you wouldn't want to do it, and that would be an immediate
No, I don't want to do it.
complaint, of course, right.
In a way, the rhetorical point I make is that you wouldn't be allowed to do this.
I don't think you would. I think you would have some struggle. I mean, I don't do human experiments, so I don't really deal with these IRBs that are called the Institutional Research Boards, which okay these experiments. I believe you would probably have quite a bit of trouble getting through, although I don't think you would have a problem necessarily saying we would like to have prisoners who have been in solitary confinement have an fMRI. Immediately afterwards, or undergo a psychological examination. In fact, you could see that this would be the appropriate thing to do, not just as an examination and not just for data, but as therapy. That if you're going to put somebody in solitary, you owe them the therapy when you take them out.
Just you tell me when you're ready. But while we're waiting, let me just ask you the question I asked Josh and so forth. You've just been thrown in solitary. How would you pass the time of day?
So I thought about that for a while because you asked me that on the phone when we talked, and I that's the problem. I thought, well, this would be really a kind of a nice break and all, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized I have the opportunity to be in solitary if I want to be, and I never take it, do I? So I don't have a plan for being in solitary, but I'm going to think about it now because clearly one could be, and I mean, not just by virtue of being in prison, but it's possible in many aspects. I mean, ostracism, as I say, has been used by cultures for a long time, and who knows when that could even happen. So I don't know really what I would do. I mean, I think I would try mental tricks. I will say this, I do believe that one of the things we don't think about the brain enough is that it has a very strong motor side to it. That is, activity is very important for the brain as well. Maybe more important than thinking and doing crossword puzzles and all that. There's actually recent evidence that suggests should all take this into account, that physical activity has a better effect on the aging brain than doing crossword puzzles and Sudoku and things like that. That you actually keep the brain in better shape by even minimal physical activity, walking and things like that. So there's a very strong motor, we call it, component to the brain. And I think maybe that's one of the things that people probably don't think about doing in solitary, but I think it would be very important to keep moving.
Okay. You guys just about ready?
Ew.
Stephanie. Okay. Thank you so much, Stuart.
Thank you, Ren.
Catherine, can you help us befriend a bug?
I'll try.
No, we don't have sound yet. And what about, do we want this light? We do, oh, okay. Okay. Befriending a bug. Are we ever really alone if we consider the ubiquity of the invertebrates? Flies, spiders, ants, and cockroaches all could easily come and go through the cracks of a prison cell, as if they were freeways, challenging the very notion of solitary. But would a bug offer companionship and therefore comfort? Or would their presence incite further terror to a confined individual? What are the physical and behavioral characteristics of an arthropod that might influence these opposite reactions? Take the fly, for example. Their incessant buzzing, always out of reach, small, quick, hard to kill, could drive anyone mad. We loathe them for spreading disease and for their larvae eating us when we die. But if a fly was your only companion, could you see it in another light? The same dramas of the human world, birth, sex, predation, war, and death, play out in the insect world. They're just on a smaller scale and take more patience to observe. Flies have earned their moniker, they breed like flies. And to do that, they have a lot of sex. They put on a veritable mini porn show. That might entertain a sex-starved prisoner. This is a male getting ready to mate. Classic sex. Creative sex, 2 males and a female. A female spreading her legs and wings after she has had multiple partners. Birth. And the ravages of old age. Humans tend to like animals with eyes. The bigger, the rounder, the better. We certainly prefer eyes to antennae. 2 legs are better than 4, which is usually preferable to 6, and no doubt for most people, superior to 8. Besides having too many legs, spiders don't even have heads. And most importantly, they don't have eyes that we can look into and relate to. Most spiders have an eye cluster mounted on a torso. Their morphology offers little opportunity for traditional engagement and companionship. But they make art. Orb weavers even make and remake their art daily, changing a solitary confinement cell into a spider's studio. Webs are beautiful by any definition of art: gossamer, delicate, intricate, and composed. They are 3-dimensional sculptures hanging in space. Who cares about a spider's lack of expression when their web it spins is a masterpiece of expression? It's difficult to befriend a bug if you cannot be certain to whom you are speaking. One fly is hard to distinguish from another, but spiders have a home address. If you call your new friend Charlotte, you can be fairly certain you are still talking to her the next day if her web is in the same general location. And Charlotte's art is lethal. If your cell has both a fly and a spider, you are in for a glorious performance of nature's ability to spin life into a dizzying ball of death. Perhaps an isolated human being might embrace the chance to spend time with another species with whom we share our unique socialness. Ants are a sophisticated social species with complex communication, organized division of labor. They are master chemists and accomplished architects. Ants invented a network communication system that rivals the internet. Without central command, individual antenna touches are like Google hits. Complex decisions are made. Ant conversation is not top-down, but bottom-up, not command and control, but connect and collaborate. At some point, a message goes viral. Leave some food for the ants, and those antenna touches will communicate a message to come visit you. To feed and care for another being, or hundreds of beings, has proven health and emotional benefits. But provide too great a bounty, and a rival colony might challenge for a place at your buffet. Is there a social species that doesn't engage in warfare? To incite an ant war is to see many gladiators locked in epic battle. I cannot imagine a creature more hated than the cockroach. The word itself is an insult in many languages. But on what is this based? They don't bite or sting or carry the dangerous pathogens that flies and mice regularly do. There is nothing life-threatening about a cockroach. Would it be possible to put disgust aside and draw companionship from one of the world's most successful creatures? Getting past the dark, twitchy exterior, the roach is a remarkably subtle and sculptural. Its wings are a glowing, translucent amber, and its long, elegant antennae explore the world with the grace of a ballerina's arms. Even cockroaches, which are not defined as a social species, seek out each other's company. When they are kept in isolation, they have significantly reduced lifespans. Like us, they enjoy hanging out together when they drink and when they eat. Their molting is a magical moment of transformation. The roach walks up and down the wall to make sure it has enough room, then it hangs upside down and drops out of its old skin. The newly emerged roach is white and delicate and soft. Cockroach sex lasts for nearly an hour. The female mates once, consequently is quite choosy, and then is pregnant for life. But maybe you are buying none of this. For some people, solitary confinement is preferable to the company of insects. Then at least a bug could provide a rare opportunity for the expression of control over your environment as you chase it around the cell and simply squish it out of existence. Humans have been doing this for a very long time. Thank you.
Catherine, just one question before you go away. You spend a lot of time with bugs, and a lot of the language you use is you get to watch them go to war, you get to, in other words, you do human projections onto bugs. Do you find yourself feeling more buggy? Does the projection go the other way around? Do you find yourself?
I wouldn't say, fortunately, that I feel buggy, but when I ordered my first batch of cockroaches and started raising them, I think it was 2 weeks straight where every dream I had, the characters in the dream, even though they were human personalities and the normal dramas of a dream, were all cockroaches. I only saw cockroaches. I didn't see, and most of them were flooding and escaping and terrifying me. And then when I went to the tropics for the first time to work with leafcutter ants, I saw ants flowing for about a week, and it took a long time to switch out of sort of the antdom back into the human drama. But it was one of my
I
dreams.
wonder in the context of somebody in Solitaire, if they were befriending a bug, how their dreams would play out in that way.
Well, chances are you wouldn't have the sheer number that I did, and I think that's what was so terrifying. And the cockroaches, because I was keeping them in terrariums, and I was terrified of them. The idea of them escaping, of course, was just a cockroach will come and go in a cell. It won't be, in their numbers.
By the way, when you go out later on, her 2 books are just amazing, so you'll enjoy those. Thank you so much. Carl. Carl Skelton is going to tell us a story about another scientist. And
Hi, I'm Carl Skelton, and I'm a recovering academic. I have worked as an artist, a community organizer, as the founding director of integrated digital media programs in a small independent engineering school, which is now a small dependent engineering school of NYU. I found myself a year and a half ago running a joint research and development project with the Institut für angewandte Medienforschung at the University of Bremen, which was a doctoral dissertation project involving distributed creative solutions to urban design and development issues, which is, of course, always a sporting proposition in New York. Looking at my 5th department head and provost in 6 years, a non-performing co-author on another book about experimental multimedia, and realizing that if I wanted to get any work done, I was going to have to quit my job. Which I did, actually, and my wife, to whom I shall be forever grateful for going along with this idea and for being happy about it after I made a pan of lasagna to celebrate my availability to domestic chores. I also, of course, am continuing with the getting done of the work, part of which, because one of the books was about experimental multimedia programming, which involved having to rethink a timeline of the development of these things outside the scope of the rather parochial histories that have been written of media, and along the way found myself browsing in the way that people browsed before you needed a computer to do it, and came across a guy who had to make much more complicated and extreme decisions, I guess, and got really terrific results. Roughly in 965 AD, a boy was born into a prominent family in Basra and named Abu Ali al-Hassan ibn al-Hassan ibn al-Haytham. And being from a family which you would think of as prominent or privileged or fancy, depending on how you approach these kinds of structures, found himself in a high government post, having been deeply immersed in study, which was, of course, at that point likely to be, and indeed was, what is now an unthinkable mashup of theology, the physical science, and mathematics, and what is much less unthinkable now, distraught at the intractability of controversies between Shiites and Sunnis in matters important, and resolved to the extent that he could to address questions to which answers actually might exist and might be verifiable. And so undertook to neglect, perhaps, as much as possible, his bureaucratic duties in favor of these longer range questions. The point of crisis for Ibn al-Haytham came when he found himself facing the Caliph of Cairo, a notoriously, how to put it delicately, enthusiastically eccentric and capricious ruler, noted for such creative acts of contemporary performance art as having all the dogs in a town he'd just conquered killed because they barked too much. And the Caliph had the expectation, and it was perhaps Ibn al-Haytham's own fault that he did, there's some vagueness about this, that Ibn al-Haytham would be able to engineer what we now know as the Aswan Dam. And according to stories which may or may not be apocryphal, because, of course, the story of this man's life rings so profoundly with the life of any academic who's found themselves at way too many meetings, doing way too much administration to think straight, and fantasized a decade of solitary confinement as the only possible way they might undertake to actually succeed at the career to which they're committed. Ibn al-Haytham, therefore, found himself in front of the Caliph, obliged to say that he could not deliver on this promise for at least 1,000 years. And the solution, as it is recorded, is that Ibn al-Haytham feigned madness in order, A, not to put the Caliph in the position of finding it amusing to have him executed in some creative way, and B, in order to provide himself with what he had really wanted all along, which was what turned out to be a decade of privacy. Now, this is variously described as prison or house arrest, depending on which version you get. It was a while ago. And during the course of the 10 years between this arrangement being set up and the death of the Caliph, thus depriving Ibn al-Haytham of his imprisonment, he wrote what may have been 92 books. And in particular, he wrote 7 books of optics as the first major upgrade since Ptolemy's Almagest of about 7 or 8 centuries previous. And in particular, going back to this business of the distress at the factional problem, something about which it turns out academics know a lot, he set himself the task, one, of being skeptical in relation to the literature. 2, of producing a methodological rather than factional reconciliation of what they called at the time the physicists, people who would do experimental stuff, and the mathematicians. And left alone, he then more or less formulated what we now think of as the scientific method, in which the experiment is not just a demonstration, but a test of an idea about how the world really works, and, of course, combines, on the one hand, rigorous review of the literature, on the other, rigorous definition of very specific questions, and on the third, the business of isolating particular pieces of reality and testing them very specifically and subjecting those physical experiments to rigorous mathematical analysis. The reconciliation of logic and sensation. Now, one of the other bits, and this brought me back to this business of how musicians will tell you that arrangement of musical structures from field recordings was invented by a musician, which happens to have happened about 15 years after it was invented by a filmmaker, and so on and so forth. What I had accepted, as many of us have, as Western science, in fact, depended in large measure on a Latin translation of the 13th century of this optics and its methodology, which were something beyond the state of the art until they were taken up in the 17th century by people like Kepler and Huygens. And so, while on the one hand, I now have a lot more time to actually engage in the broader social creative realm, the question, through the Betaville project that I've been working on with these folks in Bremen continuously, whether indeed communities can be creators, can be artists of their own physical environment. I will also never again use the phrase Western science without remembering the name Abu Ali al-Hassan ibn al-Hassan ibn al-Haytham. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So that's something to aspire to in Solitaire is reinventing the entire world of optics. But we're now going to go to another mathematician, and this is so we'll turn this up. I was very much hoping we could get Weihart here. Weihart, I've decided, is the Greta Garbo of the web. How many of you know about Weihart already? Yeah. I have tried for last 6 months to correspond with her, and I think everybody in the world must want to correspond with her. At any rate, she doesn't correspond with me. On the other hand, I think I'm going to get all of you hooked on. We'll go to the hexaflexagon one. I think the first one. Yeah. She has this remarkable voice. She began appearing 3 or 4 years ago with a series of videos of mathematical doodles, which always took the form of, so you're sitting in your math class and it's so boring, and you start doodling, and then she develops all these are little 4 or 5 minute videos, and after today, I think you'll start watching them yourself. But the one I want to show you today is with in mind what you could do if you were in solitary confinement, if all you had was a piece of paper. She talks about this thing called hexaflexagons. And so I wrote her one of those notes that if I don't hear from you, I'm assuming I can do this, and I didn't hear from her. So what we'll do for starters is show you this little 4-minute video about hexaflexagons, and then we'll do something else with it in a second. So why don't we show this video? But we have to get the sound. So let's go back and let's start it from scratch.
And if you can turn down all the house lights, please.
That's not the sound. Just a second.
Just moved from England to the US, and you've got your old school supplies from England and your new school supplies from the US, and it's your first day of school, and you get to class and find that your new American paper doesn't fit in your old English binder. The paper is too wide and hangs out. So you cut off the extra and end up with all these strips of paper. And to keep yourself amused during your math class, you start playing with them. And by you, I mean Arthur H. Stone in 1939. Anyway, there's lots of cool things you can do with a strip of paper. You can fold it into shapes, and more shapes. Maybe spiral it around snugly like this. Maybe make it into a square. Maybe wrap it into a hexagon with a nice symmetric sort of cycle to the flappy parts. In fact, there's enough space here to keep wrapping the strip, and then your hexagon is pretty stable. And you're like, I don't know, hexagons aren't too exciting, but I guess it has symmetry or something. Maybe you could kind of fold it so the flappy parts are down and the unflappy parts are up. That's symmetric, and it collapses down into these 3 triangles, which collapse down into 1 triangle, and collapsible hexagons are, you suppose, cool enough to at least amuse you a little bit during your class. And then, since hexagons have 6-way symmetry, you decide to try this 3-way fold the other way, with flappy parts up, and are collapsing it down when suddenly the inside of your hexagon decides to open right up. What? You close it back up and undo it. Everything seems the same as before. The center is not open-upable. But when you fold it that way again, it like flips inside out. Weird. This time instead of going backwards, you try doing it again, and again, and again, and you want to make one that's a little less messy, so you try again with another strip and tape it nicely into a twisty foldy loop. You decide it would be cool to color this side, so you get out a highlighter and make one yellow. Now you can flip from yellow side to white side. Yellow side, white side, yellow side, white side, white side? What? Where did the yellow side go? So you go back, and this time you color a white side green, and find that your piece of paper has 3 sides, yellow, white, and green. Now this thing is definitely cool, therefore you need to name it, and since it's shaped like a hexagon, and you flex it, and flex rhymes with hex, hexaflexagon it is. That night you can't sleep because you keep thinking about hexaflexagons, and the next day, as soon as you get to your math class, you pull out your paper strips. You'd made this sort of spirally folded paper that folds into, again, the shape of a piece of paper, and you decide to take that and use it like a strip of paper to make a hexaflexagon, which should totally work, but it feels sturdier with the extra paper. And you color the 3 sides and are like, orange, yellow, pink, and you're sort of trying to pay attention to class, math, yeah, orange, yellow, pink, orange, yellow, white? Wait a second. Okay, so you color that one green, and now it's orange, yellow, green, who knows where the pink side went? Oh, there it is. Now it's back to orange, yellow, pink, blue. Yellow, pink, blue, yellow, pink, blue, yellow, pink, blue, yellow, pink, With the old flexagon, you could only flex it one way, flappy way up. But now there's more flaps, so maybe you can fold it both ways. Yes, one goes from pink to blue, but the other from pink to orange. And now one way goes from orange to yellow, but the other way goes from orange to neon yellow. During lunch, you want to show it off to one of your new friends, Bryant Tuckerman. You start with the original simple 3-faced hexaflexagon, which you call the trihexaflexagon. And he's like, whoa, and wants to learn how to make one. And you're like, it's easy, just start with a paper strip. Fold it into equilateral triangles, and you'll need 9 of them, and you fold them around into this cycle and make sure it's all symmetric. Like the flat parts are diamonds, and if they're not, then you're doing it wrong. And then you just tape the first triangle to the last along the edge, and you're good. But Tuckerman doesn't have tape after all. It was invented only 10 years ago. So he cuts out 10 triangles instead of 9 and then glues the first to the last. Then you show him how to flex it by pinching around a flappy part and pushing it on the opposite side to make it flat and triangly, and then opening from the center. You decide to start a flexagon committee together to explore the mysteries of flexigation. But that will have to wait until next time.
Now, let me just tell you that if you go to her thing, you will get to part 2. We won't do it right now because there's something much better to do. So let's hit the lights. You can also watch her make hexaflexa tacos or burritos.
Hexaflexa Mexicans.
Hexaflexa Mexicans, exactly. Anyway, to give you some idea of how this works, Carl's daughter, Pearl, is right over here. Can you come up here? We actually need to mic her up. Do we have a mic for her? One? Yeah, let's put that on her. Because
I don't have a pocket.
About a month ago, I showed this video to Pearl, and what did you do? You can just come over here. We can sit here. Yeah. Okay, come over here and sit over here. You can sit right there.
That's one of the reasons I would never seriously entertain solitaire.
Okay, okay, very good. So tell us what you did.
I found out how to make it. Actually, my dad showed me how, and eventually, after a couple tries, I succeeded in making the hexaflexagon. And I found out
Did you make a few?
yeah, I made a couple of them. And
How many altogether did you end up making with your friends?
well, at first, I just showed my mom, and she and me started making some for this presentation. And
Do you have some here that we can hand out?
yeah, several,
Like how many?
not 100.
So why don't we, Josh, you take some and give some to Josh, but keep the ones you need for yourself.
Okay,
So hand them out to people, Josh. And other people, everybody gets, don't say that we don't provide entertainment here at the Institute. So tell us about these.
wait, Dad, where's my mom?
She's up handing them out over there, right?
Because I need the big one.
Where's the big one? Okay, just
I
a
need
sec.
the big one.
Yeah, okay. This is her flunky mother over here.
That and the other one that's already folded.
There are your tools and your markers. Oops, sorry.
Mom, I had one that was already colored.
Oh.
A big one.
You know what, I think we left that one at home.
I could have sworn we got that.
So,
And
okay.
so this is one that we prepped to show you guys. And see, like you saw, you take a strip of paper and you fold it into equilateral triangles. And 9 are needed. And then the triangles want to go the way you crease them. And so you fold them into a hexagon. And you need the flat parts to be diamonds. And then you tape the first to the last. Like this. And then you pinch the 2 triangles together and you open it up. Now I'm gonna color these.
Okay, so
This is not the side number 1,
show everybody the side number 1.
which I'm coloring like this. And then number 2, which will be and then side number 3.
So this is you'd think it just had 2 sides, but it has 3 sides.
Yeah, it does. And then there's a 6-sided one. Mom, can you get me the 6-sided one? Which, unfortunately, we can't hand out because we only brought one. And
But show it to people as it goes through.
we only have a little one. And so blue, snowflake, faces, like green leaves.
And now you're just going around with faces, green leaves, faces.
Yeah, and
what-
then flowers, birds. Hold on. Wait, was that all 6? No, I don't think so. Oh, and wait, oh shoot. It's kind of hard to get to all 6. I think I got, no, I didn't. So I'm gonna go
It takes a long time to get to the 6th one. Then it's really
Yeah.
surprised when you get it, right?
And then I'm gonna go backwards because that's easy. There, number 6.
Can you imagine it? Have you spent a lot of time doing this? Is it like exciting as you discover more things about it? And
Kind of. And like, these are pretty easy to like mess up. Like sometimes in the country when we went apple picking, I took one of the six-sided ones and I don't know how I managed to do it, but I messed it up. So I had two of another color of like one of the other sides on like, so say these two were yellow and this rest was blue, and all of them were like that, and it was kind of annoying and I couldn't figure out how to fix it. So eventually I just gave up on that one and made another one.
so, I mean, and one of the things that's fascinating, and that in the second part of Vi Hart's thing, she starts thinking about the mathematics of this, and you begin to think about, if you label them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, it goes 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 3, 3, 4, and so forth, and then 4 shows up, and you can try and figure out the math. You could spend a lot of time thinking about this, couldn't you?
Yeah. And for the six-sided hexaflexagon, you need 18 triangles, and then you twist it, and you make that into a hexagon, and it's kind of more complicated. I haven't done that yet. I've tried, but I always mess up. But these I found easier and easier to make. With a smaller strip of paper, it is now quite easy for me to get the equilateral triangle, but on this, we needed to measure it.
When you did that big.
Yeah.
Huh. And can you describe, we won't show the video, but can you describe what a hexaflexagon is?
Oh, it's, you make a hexaflexagon out of a quesadilla, and then you put guacamole and like sour cream on one side, and then you flex it, and then, so the guacamole is safely tucked into the flaps, like.
Safely tucked into the flaps, yes.
Because like, look, so I'm gonna get this to disappear by like, hold on. I can get this, the two, tucked in like that. Now you can't see it, so the guacamole was in there.
So what number was the guacamole? It was 1. And when you have 2 and 3 on the outside, the guacamole's on the inside, yeah, right?
Yes. And then the second one is beans and cheese.
Yeah.
And then you flex it only halfway and you take a bite right here.
Is it messy?
Looks like it. I haven't made it yet.
I see, but but burritos are supposed to be messy, I suppose. Yeah. Anyway, well, I think we're going to come to a stop right now, and take a little break. Just talking about that got me all hungry, right? But I think Pearl owes a great debt of gratitude. Thank you for bringing us those things. And now, before we take the break, I'm going to tell you again, there's a bookstore out there. All the people here have books and so forth. There's great things out there to get. It's a wonderful bookstore. Buy books. We'll see you here in half an hour with some more stuff. Thank you. And Pearl will stay here for a second and talk to you if you want to talk to her about it. Okay? There you go. Excellent. Fantastic. Thank you. So we're going to start this last section of dreams of solitaire, the sorts of things that one might do if one might imagine doing if one were in solitary. And we're going to start with Walter Murch, who, once again, we don't give long introductions because the introductions are all inside your flyers. But Walter is one of the great film and sound editors and has thought a lot about the qualities of film, sound, and so forth. And we'll have him. The editor of one of the great editors of sound is having trouble with the microphone. But one of the great techs. Spiro wasn't here when we applauded the tech people before, so applaud Spiro. Great. So here's Walter Murch.
This one? Okay. There are two slightly hyperbolic, but only slightly hyperbolic quotes that came to mind when I was thinking about this subject. One is from Blaise Pascal, and the other is from Goethe. Pascal said, "All human evil comes from the inability of a human being to sit in a room all by himself quietly." On the other hand, Goethe said, "A man can stand anything except a long succession of ordinary days." So the person in solitary confinement is isolated between these two polarities. I clearly have no personal experience of this, except tangentially being a film editor. Arthur Kessler, who I'm going to read from his book, his experience on solitary confinement, wrote a book, Darkness at Noon, which involved brainwashing. And in the book, he defined brainwashing as being locked in a confined environment under various degrees of stress, in an environment where people don't have your best interests at heart, with the same material repeated over and over and over again. And if you erase some of the precision in the lines, that's sort of what a film editor experiences on a day-to-day basis. There's a curious phrase about being in prison, which is doing time. And it's an odd but apt. I mean, we all know what that means, but when you try to break it down, it doesn't quite make sense. How do you do time? Time doesn't seem capable of being done. But this was the experience of Arthur Kessler, who at that time in 1937 was still a member of the Communist Party, had gone to Spain as a reporter and partly as a spy, and was caught and behind nationalist lines and almost killed at the moment he was caught, thrown in jail and condemned to death, thrown in solitary confinement and condemned to death. He wound up spending 90 days in that circumstance. He was finally, he got out because there was a prisoner exchange from the other side, and that's how he got out. But he lived on a day-by-day basis, knowing that this day might be his last, that he had no human contact other than the warden, the prison guard, who would come and bring food to him. And every day in this prison of 1,500 people, 37 prisoners were executed by firing squad, and nobody knew in advance whether that would be you or not. So the nightly patrols of who was going to be taken out was a nightly thing that they all endured. He wrote a book about this experience called Dialogue with Death, and I'm just going to read a few paragraphs from it because it's a highly perceptive author put in this extremely unusual situation for somebody of his, just the ability that he had to talk about this is remarkable. It's a unique sound. A cell door has no handle, either outside or inside. It cannot be shut except by being slammed. It is made of massive steel and concrete, about 4 inches thick, and every time it falls to, there is a resounding crash, just as though a shot has been fired. But this report dies away without an echo. Prison sounds are echoless and bleak. When the door has been slammed behind him for the first time, the prisoner stands in the middle of the cell and looks around. I imagine that everyone must behave in more or less the same way. First of all, he gives a fleeting look around the walls and takes a mental inventory of all the objects in what is now to be his domain. The iron bedstead, the wash basin, the toilet, the barred window. Excuse me. His next action is invariably to try to pull himself up by the iron bars of the window and look out. He fails, and his clothes are covered with white plaster from the wall against which he has pressed himself. Indeed, he makes all sorts of laudable resolutions. He will do exercises every morning, and he will learn a foreign language. He simply won't let his spirit be broken. He dusts off his clothes and continues his voyage of exploration around his puny realm, 5 paces long by 4 paces across. He tries the iron bed. The springs are broken. The wire mattress sags and cuts into the flesh. It's like lying in a hammock made of steel wire. He pulls a face, being determined to prove that he is full of courage and confidence. Then his gaze rests on the cell door, and he sees that an eye is glued to the spy hole, and it's watching him. The eye goggles at him glassily, its pupil unbelievably big. It is an eye without a man attached to it, and for a few moments the prisoner's heart stops beating. The eye disappears, and the prisoner takes a deep breath, presses his hand against the left side of his chest. "Now then," he says to himself encouragingly, "how silly to go and get so frightened. You must get used to that. After all, it's the official's only doing his duty by peeping in. That's part of being in prison. But they won't get me down. They'll never get me down." The daily routine of life, even of life in a condemned cell, cannot sustain for long the melodrama of despair. It banishes the agony to the dungeons of consciousness. From there, it makes itself heard only as a muffled bass drum in the symphony of the daily round and produces a vague feeling of uneasiness. Uneasiness, and not unhappiness, is the most common form of human suffering. That is, until an acute attack comes on. Then the lock gates give way and the boiling torrent of despair invades consciousness. The onslaught has begun. It's unbearable and one cannot stand it for long. One has to take a pill. Every man needs a different pill to help him arrive at a modus vivendi with his misery. The prisoners of Malaga sang the Internationale. I, too, had my pills, a whole collection of various sorts of them, from the equation of a hyperbola and my fill of days to every kind of synthetic product of spiritual pharmacy. One of my magic remedies was a certain quotation from a certain work of Thomas Mann's. Its efficacy never failed. Sometimes during an attack of fear, I repeated the same verse 30 or 40 times for almost an hour until a mild state of trance came on and the attack passed. I knew it was the method of the prayer mill, of the African tom-tom, of the age-old magic of sounds. Yet, in spite of my knowing it, it worked. A similar effect to that of these anesthetizing exercises I could obtain by the opposite method, that is, by a sharp, abstract speculation. I would start a train of thought deliberately at some given point, such as Freud's theory about death or the calculation of an elliptical orbit. After a few minutes, a state of feverish exaltation was evoked, a kind of running amok in the realm of reasoning, which usually ended in a daydream. After a while, I became sober again and the attack had passed. The healing power of both methods was derived from the same device, that of merging the stark image of the firing squad with the general problem of life and death, of merging my individual misery with the biological misery of the universe. Just as the vibrations and tensions of a wireless receiver, radio, are conducted to Earth where they disperse, I had earthed my distress. In other words, I had found out that the human spirit is able to call upon certain aids of which in normal circumstances it has no knowledge, and the existence of which it only discovers in itself in abnormal circumstances. They act, according to the particular case, either as merciful narcotics or ecstatic stimulants. The technique which I developed under the pressure of the death sentence consisted in the skillful exploitation of these aids. The astonishing thing, the puzzling thing, and the consoling thing about this time was that it passed. I am speaking the plain, unvarnished truth when I say that I did not know how. I tried to catch it in the act. I lay in wait for it, riveted my eyes on the second hand of my watch, resolved to think of nothing else but pure time. I held it like the simpleton in the fable who thought that to catch a bird, you had to put salt on its tail. I stared at the second hand for minutes on end, for quarters of an hour on end, until my eyes watered with the effort of concentration and a kind of trance-like stupor set in. And what I did not know afterwards was how long a time I had been observing in its passing. Time crawled through this desert of uneventfulness as though lame in both feet. I have said that the astonishing and consoling thing was that in this pitiable state it should pass at all. But there was something that was more astonishing, that positively bordered on the miraculous, and that was that this time, these interminable hours, days, weeks, months, passed more swiftly than a period of times has ever passed for me before. I was conscious of this paradox whenever I scratched a fresh mark on the white plaster of the wall, and with a particular shock of astonishment when I drew a circle around the marks to celebrate the passage of weeks and later the months. What? Another week, a whole month, a whole quarter of a year. Didn't it seem like only yesterday that this cell door had banged behind me for the first time? This time problem is the main problem of existence for every prisoner. And not only the prisoner, but of everyone who exists in unnatural, confined conditions, in hospitals, in exile. It is truly strange, this will-o'-the-wisp time. If we experience time of such a quality that we have to look with a yawn at our watch to count the minutes, as soon as its existence is brought to our consciousness, we may be sure that it will be extinguished in the memory. The only time that is unforgettable is that time during which one forgets that time exists. Only that time is fertile, which remains chaste and unsullied by the touch of consciousness. While I was living down these blank days and speculating upon time, out in the courtyard, outside the window, the courtyard, 37 men were shot, but I did not know it at this time. March 3rd, yesterday the first month of imprisonment is over. I am incapable of visualizing the future at all concretely, despite constant speculation and forgetting and forging plans. But all plans are somehow dreamlike and unreal. All thought more and more takes the form of daydreaming. Whenever the cell door opens, fresh air from the corridor makes me dizzy and I have to hold on to the table. If a warder addresses me, a word to me, I grow hoarse with excitement. Despite all my feelings of self-respect, I cannot help but look on the warders as superior beings. The consciousness of being confined acts like a slow poison, transforming the entire character. This is more than mere psychological change. It is not an inferiority complex. It is rather an inevitable natural process. When I was writing my novel about the gladiators, I always wondered why the Roman slaves, who were twice, 3 times as numerous as the free men, did not turn the tables on their masters. Now it is beginning gradually to dawn on me what the slave mentality really is. I could wish that everyone who talks of mass psychology should experience a year in prison. We lived an unusual life in that prison. The constant nearness of death weighed down and at the same time lightened our existence. Most of us were not afraid of death, only of the act of dying, and there were times when we overcame even this fear. At such moments we were free, men without shadows, dismissed from the ranks of the mortal. It was the most complete experience of freedom that can be granted. Such moments do not repeat themselves, and when one is back on the treadmill of ordinary life, all that remains is the feeling that one has forgotten something in cell number 41. Between the siesta and the evening meal one day, the cell door flew open and freedom was hurled at me like a club. I was stunned and stumbled back into life, just as, had things taken a different course, I should have stumbled into death. As I stood in the corridor, I shook from head to foot, overpowered by the same nervous trembling as on that night when someone outside my cell had called for help. Byron and the newcomer grasped me under the armpits and after a few steps, I am all right again. I feel the hot sun on my face, inhale a mouthful of air, and then everything suddenly turns gray, green, and black, and I find myself sitting on the ground. At first, I can do nothing but breathe in the air, real air again for the first time, instead of the dense gaseous mixture compounded of the odor of the stuffy bed, the stale food, and the stench of the toilet on which I have existed for the past months. Thank you.
Next up, two of my colleagues at NYU, Jacques Servin of the Yes Men, who are kind of antic political activists, and his colleague Mary Notari will talk to us. Well, the challenge I placed for them was: is it possible to do political activism in solitary?
We're kind of clowns. We're an activist group called the Yes Men. We run a Yes Lab at NYU where we help people come up with funny projects around important issues. And Ren asked us if there was something we could do in solitary that would be meaningful as activism, if there was any conceivable action we could do that would actually change anything about our circumstance or about anything. And
so yeah.
Still
Yeah.
nothing on the screen. Can we get the projector on?
Here, let's go.
So you can click it on you now. Oh, okay.
Yeah, thank you.
There it is. Okay.
Cool. So we tried to think about what we could do in solitary, and we came up with things like pretty much along the lines that we already do, which is come up with silly press releases, silly announcements to make from our solitary cell. And, you know, we came up with a few things like this, and honestly, they're kind of lame.
Yeah.
And present another problem in and of itself, which is who are we releasing this to besides ourselves?
Yeah, we quickly realized that the answer is no, and it was interesting to think through why no. And I think the answer is that meaningful political action actually requires a bit of agency, an audience with some agency, and there's absolutely, and this is a nice chart explaining the concept. So yeah,
Yeah.
You could
so if there's no audience, or when you're in solitary, who is your audience? The guards, the other inmates that are within shouting distance from you, and like Jacques said, there's no agency, there's no purpose to be served by getting their attention.
The warden, who you think might have agency, doesn't actually have agency. It's just rules, and they're trained to deal with whatever comes their way. It's the same thinking that you could actually do something to the wardens is kind of the mistake a lot of activists make, thinking you could appeal to CEOs of big companies that are ruled by their shareholders. You just can't do anything about it. There are rules, and they do what they're told by the market, or they're fired. So if the warden actually did something, he'd be fired, replaced by somebody who did. And the only way you can actually do something, the only way you could do something in solitary, I think, would be to imagine a future in which you have an audience that has a bit of agency. So once you get out, or once you're moved to the general prison population, it would be funner to think about what you could do when you get out to actually do something about it.
Yeah. And that'd be a great way of occupying ourselves while we imagine, at least while in solitary. So the sort of actions that we do, the sort of activism that we do, involve creative media actions, whether that's hijacking a brand, whether that's creating fake press releases or create companies and fake personas. And we do all this with the aim of reaching a broad audience with like a flash of information. So we boil down problems, we maybe translate them, could be a way of thinking about it, into sound bites that are easily replicable and communicate the issue in as short a time as possible.
Alternately, we assemble those actions into a movie, and this is just an opportunity to tell you we're making a movie. called the Yes Men Are Revolting, which assembles a bunch of actions. And then you can sit people down, not for as long as this conference, but for an hour and a half and transmit messages. But the kind of actions that we're talking about that you can use to communicate something horrific, I don't know what we would actually come up with in Solitaire, but we'd start probably by thinking about what actions we could be inspired by. And there's a bunch of actions that have been done to communicate really horrible things, at least just a flash about them so that you start thinking about them, and hopefully it guides you into following up, and even more, even better, taking action on them. This is Operation First Casualty, where veterans of the Iraq War against the war staged the Battle of Fallujah in Times Square, impromptu, without telling anyone. So here they're carrying wounded comrades. They also wrestle people to the ground and handcuff them. And the result is shock and a flash of recognition, and then they pass out information, getting people, where they recognize, getting people to recognize what they've just seen.
And one thing that I'd like to add about these type of actions is the whole purpose is to bring the reality of something that is experienced by the people staging these actions to a broader audience.
Mm-hmm. And this is somebody who, this is an Iraqi, Wafa Bilal, who made a website, Dog or Iraqi. And this was around the Guantanamo waterboarding controversy, where suddenly we were allowed to waterboard people, which it had been considered a form of torture, and suddenly it was deemed not. So you could choose, as a general internet visitor, which one you would waterboard, the dog or the Iraqi. You could vote and click. So the intention there, and I won't tell you who won, but you could choose, the idea was you would definitely not choose the dog, right? I mean, waterboarding a dog is horrific. So that means you have to choose the person, and that's even more horrific. It puts you in a real double bind. And another example of that is puppy burning. In the 60s, the yippies would go around and post notices announcing puppy burnings at the main fountain on campus at noon. And people would show up ready to see to stop this horrific thing. And they'd even hold up a puppy and some kerosene poured on the puppy. Other people would be around to make sure people didn't interfere, take a match and light the puppy on fire, except it was water, so the puppy didn't actually catch on fire. And then they would say, well, you're horrified about this dog, but we're actually burning people in Vietnam, or napalm. And so it's a shock tactic to get that across. So that might be another way to find inspiration for what you might do around solitary confinement. Ausländer Raus, this takes a while to explain.
Yeah, and this is one of ours, actually. And by ours, I mean the Yes Lab. So the Yes Lab is an organization that was started by the Yes Men to bring those tactics to other issues and campaigns and other organizations. So through the Yes Lab, a group of activists from the Bronx came to us wanting to do something in response to the NYPD policy of stop and frisk. And so what they came up with is a fiction. They created an entire fiction that involved a fake website, fake press releases, video, corporate-looking video, as well as homespun cell phone video. And all this was in relation to was creating a fiction around a fake partnership between the NYPD and McDonald's, and that the NYPD and McDonald's were partnering to respond to the community's outrage against the massive racial profiling that goes along with stop and frisk. And so by offering free Happy Meals to victims of stop and frisk who were faced with no summons or charges or arrest, that was a way that they were responding, and a way of garnering up outrage against this very real policy.
Yeah, and this was the voucher where you would print your name and ethnicity, and then the badge number of the stopping, and then of the officer each time, and you take it to McDonald's. And this actually turned into a mainstream news program on news slot on ABC. So it was actually successful in getting the word out, which might, under excellent circumstances, translate into action to stop and frisk. Here's the mother of all shock tactics. National television in Belgium plotted for 2 years to pull a prank on the Belgian populace. They interrupted a news program. That's the first image there as it's being interrupted. Pretended like they had a sudden, very important announcement to make, and they announced that the country was being split in two, and that Flanders was seceding from Wallonia. And here's the newscaster standing in front of the new Flemish Parliament, replacing the Belgian Parliament. And they spent 2 hours examining this, showing riot footage and all that, showing the king fleeing the palace, having talk shows where they would talk about the implications of this. Oh, this is terrible, this has happened. Imagine the example to the rest of the world. And so the point was to basically try to wake people up with this situation to the possibilities and to get people not to do it. So all this would, hopefully we could spend some time thinking about these things. This is gratuitous. And just spend some time thinking about these things that people have actually done to raise awareness of these issues, which are horrific, maybe not quite as horrific in most cases, except the napalm one, as solitary confinement, or actually the Dog-Iraqi one as well. Actually, Fallujah as well, yeah.
They're all pretty horrific.
They're all pretty horrific. But so we'd spend a while thinking of those and try to just draw parallels and figure out what we could do. And then maybe that would occupy about 1 day, because these are actually pretty simple projects and it's not very hard to come up with ideas around them. And then the second day we could think about how to spin that into an actual campaign, and what kind of action we'd ask people to take. Start imagining the campaign website and all that. That might be the second day. The third day, probably have to start folding hexaflexograms.
Yeah.
So that's our plan, yeah.
So I also have to set up my, Spiro, I need to get up to the slide projector here. Will it be on this one? Give us 1 second. The next person we're going to talk to is Dan Tagey, who we're going to call him actually in New Orleans. Okay, so this is Dan. Can you hear us?
Yes. Hi.
Hi. How are you?
I'm good.
So we're having this conference here talking about solitary, and I was just mentioning to them that you yourself, not a solitary experience, but you did have an experience of being wrested from the middle of your life. We're looking at the picture of you looking at us in your black T-shirt with your tattoos, right?
It was right after I got rescued by some firefighters from Houston off of a rooftop.
That's you being rescued. And
that was the rescue boat there.
And then here I have you in yellow. In the next...
Oh yeah, that was this was about 4 days earlier. I was riding around in this big canoe getting provisions, and people wanted the same stuff everywhere, almost unanimously: wine and toilet paper.
Wine and toilet paper. There's the name of the book.
Only in New Orleans, yeah.
But eventually, and I'm going to go through fairly quickly some of the slides before we get to the money shot, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
But eventually, did you move from to a room, or what happened next?
I got sent to a Red Cross in Texas, and I didn't have any bank accounts that would work because I had local banks, so I had access to really nothing. And I used the money to go to New York, and I stayed in a Radisson hotel at the airport Radisson at JFK, which was termed the refugee hotel.
And so in the refugee hotel, you became an artist again. And I'm just going to start showing some of the kinds of things you were doing, having been stripped of all your previous kinds of tools. Here's the wave.
Yeah, this one is cut from loose leaf after Hokusai's Great Wave. Yeah.
And then the skull.
Using whatever materials I had at hand. And the skull is made from I took some pages from the Gideon's Bible about the Great Flood and made the skull out of it, and used some correction fluid I got from the receptionist desk to make that kind of texture where I whited out the rest of the words.
And so
the decomposition in the skull.
I wonder if they have Gideon's Bibles in Solitary. We can ask later on. But here comes a very strange picture. Tell us what this is.
Let's see. Oh, this one is, I actually took a photograph of myself, and I cut out the eyes and the nose and the mouth and glued them to my throat. So the top of my head there is actually the back of my...
You're getting a large O.
Like I don't know, like kind of a...
So here, just continuing on rather quickly though, what is this thing woven here?
This is about 18 poker cards that I had found in the lobby there, and there's a saying on the bottom that says there's a tie that binds us to our homes, and which seemed pretty appropriate as the chain is binding to their homes, and there's a bone in between that neither one of them can get. So the kind of security of home, and also the how it should also be a hindrance in a time like this.
All made out of playing cards, and then next,
yeah,
your superheroes.
That was from some magazines, comic books I got from just a store, and I cut out all the heroes. It was called All My Heroes Are Super. Kind of the idea, like if there was some kind of mystical hero that could save the day, it would be a good time for that.
Next, we have from an atlas, I guess. What happened?
This was kind of like a map, like we get at the educator store for a high school classroom, and I cut all the states out. It's called One Nation Underwater. Kind of how it affected the entire country, not just, I don't think it was so isolated to New Orleans. I think it seemed that it played out pretty nationally, and there was a lot of compassion there.
You got these planes?
These are all 2-inch die-cast bombers of planes that flew missions over the Middle East since 1971. It's led by God Bless America in the front there. And I put them in this kind of migrating pattern.
And we have, this looks like a Mondrian.
Yeah, it's, I reversed the white for black. It's called Night Boogie. Being in New York, I got an appreciation for his Broadway boogie. You can really see it. It's pretty great. This is made from Legos.
This is made from Legos?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm going to run ahead, actually, because I want to get to the money. So I'm going to go through a few things quickly. But then suddenly we get to, this is the first of the money pieces. And some of you may recognize this from the New Yorker money issue. But this one here says State of Fear. It just struck me that if all you had in prison in Solitary was a dollar bill, you could begin to do some interesting things. How did this happen?
Well, if I had money in Solitary, I'd probably be really popular when I got out of Solitary, I would imagine. The State of Fear just comes about just the way I think money is just spent on this kind of idea of fear, of economic fear, of terror fear, that I think it drums a lot of money and it gets funneled into wars and people and during disasters it seems to be you get put on the back burner. I mean, I had friends in Rockaway who got trumped by the election that was spending billions of dollars on an election, and they had 4 feet of water in their houses.
But this is made out of a single bill, this State of Fear?
Just a single bill, yeah.
And the next one?
The end is near. So I fold them to find the words, the phrases I need to have, and also I make some aesthetic decisions. Like I like 2 eyes kind of peering out, the all-seeing eye, and then Washington's eye also looking at you. And
then we got the next one.
Oh, the heat is on. I like this idea of things building up, and the heat is on really came about right as this kind of housing bubble was about to explode, and just knowing that this impending recession was coming. Made a huge
Are these
on.
all the same? Are these all $1 bills, or do you have a different rule for different kinds of bills?
These are all single so far, all single bills.
So if you had a single, how long does it take you to come up with one of these?
Some come pretty quickly, and some take quite a long time.
Here's the next one. I'm looking at the next one right now, the American Idol.
This one was great. Well, money is the is the idol, and I folded it so Washington is kind of this Kilroy symbol on the bottom. So yeah, I like to get a lot of aesthetic quality out of it. I mean, I wanted to seem like it was a crumpled bill, but at the same time, there's aesthetic decisions going on along with trying to find the words as well.
Here comes the next one. Trust no one.
Trust no one. Well, that one is kind of self-explanatory. Maybe not a great rule to live by, but some skepticism is always necessary, I think.
And
live free or die. This one is the first where I really used multiple bills. This is 4 bills here.
so you have to be richer to be able to live free or die.
Correct. Yeah. I sold a few trust no one, so I was able to make a bigger bill. Yeah.
Yeah. So how many bills does it take to make a revolution?
Revolution is 3 bills. 3.
We need a revolution, and we can have it for 3 bills, folks.
The revolution is cheaper than living free. Yeah.
I think that's the lesson we learned from that.
Yeah.
Are they all $1 bills?
Popular with Occupy Wall Street. I'd seen someone someone sent me a picture had this bill. Someone had got off the internet and made a sign out of it.
And these are all $1 bills, though. So 3 $1 bills, or what? Or do you?
Oh no, this one is a 1, a 50, and a 20.
Revolution is really expensive.
Really, yeah.
It's really something that only the 1% can do it, I guess.
Yeah, it's a 1% revolution. Yeah.
Okay, and now we have, what is this next one?
Don't tread on me. So this one is kind of playing on these kind of iconic phrases of Americana, and of course associating with everything to money. Yeah. So it's easier to not get tread on when you have a lot of money, especially in the prison system. More money gets you further, for sure.
I've gone on to the next one.
This is the kids are all right, so I'm starting to look a little bit more optimistic here, even though education cuts are devastating me, especially in Louisiana and federally. Hopefully that can turn around, now that Big Bird has a job again.
You were saying you want to end up on a optimistic tone, but the next one is...
resistance is futile. This kind of contradicts the whole revolution. So, I mean, yes, I was able to get a little bit sci-fi with this one, but I think the images, the phraseology is pretty right on with politics. Right.
So let's see here. This is the very last one here.
This is the newest one, the almighty dollar. Actually, this one is really, really new.
How long? But seriously,
$1 bills.
Just thank you for all that. But if you had a few dollars in solitary, could you imagine entertaining yourself for a while with this, or would it get tiresome?
Well, I've been entertaining myself since about 2007, so it's
So maybe you have to be a certain kind of artist to be able to.
But it seemed like it's a little different.
Anyway. Well, listen, Dan. Thank you so much. We appreciate this nomination of something one could do, and good luck down there.
Thanks a lot, Ren. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye.
So now we have another artist with another sort of possible intervention, and this is Samantha Holmes. Is this yours?
This is mine.
Okay. So.
Oh, I am attached to you.
Oh, making it worse. But. Samantha Holmes is, as you will see, a remarkable mosaicist. She'll talk to us a bit about that.
Yes. When Ren called me a couple of weeks ago to ask what I would do if I were in solitary confinement, the answer was pretty clear. I was actually staying in an old military prison at the time in the countryside of Russia. recently converted into a mosaic studio by the Ismail Akhmedov Foundation. I was working 12, 14, 16-hour days, barely interacting with others, finishing up my work for a group show to be held in Moscow a few weeks later. Mosaic is, above all, a solitary practice. The technique is slow and intensive. Each tile is cut and placed by hand. This is part of why you don't see much mosaic being done today in a world where everything is expected to happen so quickly. When you're working on a mosaic, time goes by in a very different way, measured in inches, not in hours. At times, you forget to eat, to socialize. In this, perhaps, it might be well suited to solitary confinement. It's as much a meditation as an art form. The process of laying the tiles is one of careful consideration, not only of placement, but size, particular shape, inclination, how it will catch the light, how close it lays to those beside it. You develop a relationship with each material. Every marble, stone, or glass has its own particular properties: color, durability, reflection of light. You form a relationship with them. You know their inconsistencies. You know their touch. The materials and techniques that we use today are the same as those that we've been using for centuries, making the history of the medium all the more relevant. It's the medium of Greek mythology and Byzantine spirituality. In the 20th century, it's picked up by Italian fascism and Soviet communism. It's uncanny, the formal and technical similarities that we can trace across the centuries. Ancient Roman chariots and fascist tanks. The Christian church and the American capitalists. What connects these works is not the content of their message, but the strength of the ideologies that they represent. Mosaic is the medium of empires. This last one is a mosaic I was studying just this week, actually, at Rockefeller Center. To date, I've found more than 100 mosaics built in New York at the start of the 20th century, just at the time of the city's great capitalist boom. Again, mosaic comes in when ideologies coalesce. So why does this happen? Part of it is the nature of the material itself, glass, stone, and marble, that convey, above all, a sense of permanence. Vasari, in his Lives of the Artists, refers to mosaic as painting for eternity, a concept that is immediately picked up by the Vatican, who to this day employs a team of mosaicists to recreate its paintings in glass and stone. In this way, mosaic becomes a material metaphor for permanence, for time, both in an earthly sense, attesting to the assumed longevity of the depicted subject, and in a spiritual one, by creating a parallel with the immortal paradise promised by the great religions. Now, this kind of permanence, this kind of faith, isn't what I'm trying to capture in my work. It's actually quite the opposite. In the last century, Western societies, and in particular urban societies like ours, have turned away from belief in something larger than ourselves. The old empires have fallen. Religion no longer seems to provide us with clear answers to our questions about life, death, justice. But we still have those questions. My work uses the technical and conceptual framework of mosaic to address the ambiguities of contemporary society. I want to talk about dissolution rather than permanence. I want to talk about uncertainty and desire and doubt, all within the context of those old belief systems. So back to the piece that I was creating in the Russian prison. This piece, installed 3 weeks ago in Moscow, is the first in a series of site-specific works called the Absence Project. Positioned within the arch of a worn building structure, 2 lines of tesserae trace the outline of a central figure that is left unfilled, a void through which one sees the wall behind. Both our instincts and our memories of other similar images, again, that context of mosaic, tell us that there should be a figure there. This space, not nothing, but a delineated absence, is meant to evoke a sensation of emptiness and of loss. We feel an instinctual desire to fill that space, without any clear sign as to how we might do so today. Context is everything in this work. The piece is installed in the bricked-up doorway of an old factory in the heart of Moscow. The building complex, recently converted into the Art Play Design Center, site of last year's Moscow Biennale, shows the traces of its physical history: scraped walls, old bricks, dangling wires that attest to the lives passed within its walls. The sense of permanence invoked by the mosaic lies in direct contrast to this deterioration, underlining the gap between the ideal world promised by the church and by the medium, in which there is justice, reason, immortality, and that in which we find ourselves, complicated, painful, ultimately given to decline. The building acts as a frame to the mosaic, which in turn frames the wall within the figure, suggesting that in place of the saints, we might learn to hallow this other broken surface, the world as we really know it. This project takes on additional meaning in relation to each context. In Ravenna, Italy, home to the greatest surviving Byzantine mosaics, and incidentally my home for a good part of each year, the figure's absence might refer to both the loss of individual faith and a sort of collective nostalgia for the city's cultural and historical past. In New York, it might express the last longings of a city in which everything is possible, but nothing is sacred. In prison, I think this project would give me the space to ask questions about the enormous gap between the inadequacy of our current justice system and that promise of biblical judgment that would offer each of us exactly the punishment or rewards appropriate to his life. I think probably there's some solace to be found in believing in that latter, some kind of hope in its very possibility. But there would also be the reality of the life that I was living, my solitude, my doubt, I would hope, my innocence. In that sense, and again, in the very slowness of the process of making, the work would become a tool for private meditation, both in the act of its creation and in its subsequent existence in the cell. The tools for mosaic are relatively simple: a hammer and chisel, a bit of cement, stone. Essentially the same tools that chain gangs have been using for centuries. But I don't know that prison guards would really let me have a hammer and chisel in solitary. For me, mosaic doesn't have to be limited to traditional materials. It's a set of conceptual implications. It can be created from found materials, metal, rubber, bits of cement. It can be wood and carbon, or paper. What's central to the medium is the patience that it requires, the ritual slowness of the process, and the devotion necessary to lend repeated action a larger purpose. This is a piece called Novena, also produced in Moscow, named for a 9-day prayer of petition to the Virgin Mary. In this work, a single sheet of paper is folded in upon itself and bound with wire in a moment of private meditation. The intended devotion is not written, but contained in the motions, the traces of the act itself. The papers are assembled into 9 columns, whose length depends on the dedication of which I was capable in a given day, about 2.5 meters at its longest. This piece was quite challenging for me personally. I'm not very religious, and this work was an attempt to confront the possibilities of that faith, but the consolation it may offer and the doubts that linger in myself. The whiteness of the paper represents both the purity of the intended prayer, should there be someone, something that listens, and the possibility of their emptiness, if there is not. In mosaic, this emptiness matters as much as the material itself in defining an image. We create lines with the spaces between the tesserae. Perhaps it is this aspect, above all, that might offer us a metaphor for the world today, focusing not on our ideologies, but on the spaces between them. Thanks.
Just before you go down, I was just going to say, could you imagine, I'm going to get my thing. Where am I? I was thinking, could you imagine doing this with chewing gum and chewing gum wrapper, for example?
Yes. I mean, the nice thing about mosaic is it really is a kind of paradigm for thought and for examination of a material. So what that material is doesn't matter so much as how you look at it, how you use it, and essentially how you put it together. So anything that can be scaled and multiplied can make a mosaic.
And now that I asked you the question, do you think...
Do you want that?
No. Do you think you'd be any good at this? Do you think you could survive? Do you think this would be a way of doing time, as has been said?
I think it would keep me busy for quite some time. I think the realities, obviously, of Solitaire are more complicated. But what it does give you is a way to have a dialogue and have a relationship with a material that I think can give you back some of what's missing in the relationship you would have with another person.
Thank you so much. Oh, the last of the people I asked when I was putting this together was Mike Daisy, who, as you know, and who, as you'll see in a second, is one of our great monologists. Oh. And I specifically, the question I asked him is whether, what it would be like for a monologist to be in solitary. And so here's Mike Daisy, perhaps with an answer.
Good afternoon. I found this a very intriguing question, the question of what would happen in solitary. And it's been really interesting. I've been here for pretty much all of the day listening to people's sort of hypothetical constructions of what they might do. And what interests me is it's a rigged game, which is great because there's lots of rigged games in the world, so it's always instructive to engage in one wholeheartedly. It's a rigged game, we all know that. We all know how this is going to go because it was outlined in the program, because we all have a sense of what is to come. But the people who follow me are going to have a much more intimate sense of what it actually means to be solitary. So in a sense, this is all pointless, but that actually makes it a very effective way of simulating being in solitary, I would think, because the feeling of hopelessness, the knowledge that what you are doing is pointless, is actually implicit in everything that's happening, right? So what fascinates me is, so I watch the day and I work extemporaneously, so I had a rough idea of what I thought I might talk about, but I didn't really. I was mostly sort of tabula rasa. And I was watching people talk, and a large number of the people who are very sharp, smart, learned, excellent people, I'm sure, but their systems and methodologies are often built around suppositions that are, frankly, crazy, because we're not going to have anything, you're not going to have anything outside yourself. We're not going to have any of these devices. Like, we don't even know if we'll have a dollar bill or a bit of chewing gum. We can hope, but making a plan now for what we'll do if we should be so lucky is to have a dollar bill and a bit of chewing gum. I mean, this is a future where those things will be what is devoutly to be wished, that we had those fucking things. More likely is we will not have those things. We'll have the things we didn't expect, like a jailer who interrupts solitary to kick you in the head, or your fecal matter. You'll have things like that is what we'll have. If we're lucky, they may even take the fecal matter away from us immediately. I don't even know yet. I'm going to find out in a little while, just like the rest of you. So one of the things that's clarifying for me is that I am able, because of the terms of this question, I'm able to unbind myself to some degree, insofar as any of us can, from ego. Because I'm a monologuist and I work extemporaneously. I work exactly as you are hearing me work right now. I speak with and connect with audiences. I try to gather them together even when the lighting is shitty and the room is, ooh. I try to gather the energy together and talk about what's going on. That's an anthropological process that requires, by its nature, other people. It's not just not possible in solitary. It literally does not exist. I don't rehearse it. There is nothing. There's no there, which in a sense frees me to actually wrestle with the core of the problem. Like, what would I actually do? I have the tools for this useless art form. And I think most of the artists and other thinkers today would be in a similar position where the tools would seem to be useful, but then prove to be pointless. And what do you do walking into that situation? I grew up in far northern Maine, and I was a lonely misanthropic child. And I was a misanthrope because I was essentially a hateful child. I was one of those children who, I was like a little Andy Rooney. I just was very I just did not like other people. I complained constantly about the nature of things, and from a very young age, like we're talking 3rd, 4th grade, at a time when more normal children are cavorting, and I don't know what they're doing because I wasn't looking at them, because I was this very inward-looking misanthrope, and in northern Maine, a very cold and desolate place, the kind of environment where it is winter 11 months of the year and then 1 month is fly season. In that environment, my mother, I remember this so vividly, my mother would tell me to go outside, and she'd be like, to play, and she'd make me go out and play. And of course, we lived in this remote rural area, so there were no neighbors, and it'd be like 3 or 4 miles one way, the next house. So you just go out and just sort of sit in a snowbank in the great Beckettian whiteness all around you, the complete absence, and just wait for the time to pass when you'd be allowed to go back inside. And so I think a large amount of why I'm a storyteller now is because I'm fundamentally, spiritually deformed in this way. Like fundamentally, that period of my life caused me from an early age to really enshrine the idea not just of telling stories, but of crafting entire universes in my mind. Like, I would spend an inordinate amount of time, and by inordinate I mean all of it. I would spend all of my time building complex, fantastical structures, often that were pulled completely from fantasy, and they would be, wild imaginings of pulp, science, and fiction, incredibly derivative at times, and other times shockingly original. Now that I look back on them, they'd be sitting right side by side. So I had no qualms because I was so young. I had not developed taste yet, that terrible affliction that hurts every artist. I didn't have taste yet, and so I was perfectly happy to have my own version of Jedi before George Lucas came back and ruined them for everyone. My own version of what those early movies might have looked like in my own made-up mind, sitting side by side with a world filled with people who have no faces, who wear these masks. I remember this so vividly. They have a series of masks, and each mask is an expression, and they carry them with them in packs on their back when they march up through the woods. And those fantasies would sit right next to each other, even though one is arguably, oh, that's somewhat interesting, let's talk about that and what it means about you and your psychology, and the other is just a derivative of a movie that had influenced me very deeply, but I didn't make any distinctions between them because the imagination, when it's hungry, feeds on everything that's around it. So I was an unhappy child, and fundamentally an imaginative child, feeling he was trapped in this bubble universe. And I also, at a young age, younger than this, was a weird child. Like, I was very clearly one of those children that you would drown. Like, in another age, we would drown this child, and we don't do that anymore. And sometimes I think, it worked out for me, but I don't know fundamentally. Maybe we should still be drowning people like this. Like, maybe there's a reason we feel that compulsion where we want to kill them, except apparently for our parents who feel like they want to love the child, no matter how misanthropic it is. Or so I'm assured, although some of you here are probably parents and probably secretly would assure me that you too wanted to drown your child. You're just not allowed to speak of it. But as a young child, I didn't speak. I didn't speak for a really long time. I'm not good with childhood development. Like, I'm not good at remembering what the correct age it is to speak, but I was well beyond that. And in fact, to the point where, my mother, who's really not book learned in any way, even she was like, he should be talking by now. And I was the oldest, so I was the first one that you make all the mistakes with. So they had no guideline to go by, and they took me in to see, if I was mentally defective in some way. And no one could figure anything out, and I didn't seem to be defective. I just simply wasn't talking. And then when I did speak, when I did finally start talking, I'm told that I began speaking in complete sentences. And now, obviously, that disease has gotten worse, and I speak in complete paragraphs. But you understand what I'm saying. And then as I grew, I was always this large, strange-looking creature, large, round, and especially in high school and early college, I had a huge number of physical traits that were outside the norm. I engaged in an inordinate amount of physical repetitive motion. Like this thing I'm doing right now with my right hand, I can do this for hours. And I find it really soothing. Like, I really enjoy the feeling of each pad of the finger coming down on my thumb, and I can feel the difference between one finger and the other finger and the rhythm, and if it changes, I can feel that, and I enjoy it in a way that is entirely pre-verbal, that is not built out of words. You know, words, those pathetic betrayers, which if you are in a cell are worthless. There's no point to your words. You cannot write them down. And there is no one to communicate with. The universe has shrunk down to this box. There's nowhere for the words to go. The words are an illusion, like they always fucking were. You're not actually going to be able to speak to anyone. You're not actually going to be able to get a word out. And there is no one to speak with because you are there. You are the generator of the words. If there is no one to speak to, if there is no audience, there is no point to speaking. So, I mean, I wouldn't be speaking. I would be doing this a lot. I'd be patting my arm in this particular way. When I was young, I used to do this a lot. A lot. Oh my God, it's still so soothing. Like when I do it now, I trained myself out of it my freshman year of college because someone who's now a professor of theater at another college told me on first meeting me, he met me in theater class and I was sitting in the corner. And remember, I'm a large man, right? So we have certain stereotypes about that. I have a large man, I'm sitting on the floor of the theater lab, I'm rocking back and forth, as I was prone to do. Like I rock uncontrollably if I'm not thinking about it. And I have a pencil in my hand, and I'm flicking it back and forth in my left hand, and I'm doing this. It's theater, so perhaps I am exaggerating slightly the scale, but I swear to you, I think I am only exaggerating slightly. It was really extreme, like how much, because the pleasure of it is so internal that it's better than masturbating, frankly, and you can do it in public, and people, for a while, don't tell you to stop. And that's sort of the problem, is there's no social stigma directly against it. And my friend let me know that he was like, oh, it's a room full of people, and this is like maybe a mentally challenged person who's been invited to sit in, or maybe we're going to be studying him to emulate him in exercises later. What I'm saying is, if I was younger, if I'd been born in a different age, an age we live in now, I don't really fully doubt that I would have been medicated. I would have been medicated at an early age because I think when I read articles based on knowing very little, but based on what I see, I think I would fall somewhere on what they call that spectrum of autism. I think I would fall somewhere on that spectrum, and I think I would be medicated to remove these symptoms, but I would not have any such medication in solitary. And that's a gift, because those movements, those physical parts of me, that body is the only thing I can be assured is coming into the room with me. My words are not coming because there's no one to speak to. My mind is coming, but purely as meat baggage in my skull. But my body is physically there. The physical kinesthetic sensations are physically there. I am physically present. And so the truth is, in that room, my art would avail me nothing. And I would probably engage in elaborate fantasies that are pre-verbal, even more primitive over time than the ones I did as a child in those snowbanks, because that was a different world. I could turn my head and see different things in every direction. This would be a smaller world, and in that smaller world, I would move again and again and again, and that would soothe me, and I would craft my own door. You know, Ursula Le Guin, who I think is one of the really important writers, especially in fantasy over the last 50 or 60 years. She wrote this trilogy of books, this Earthsea trilogy, about a world full of wizards and princes and such. It's also an elaborate metaphor of the books, and in the third book, people open a crack in the world, and all the magic of the world starts pouring out. And the deal is that it's the people who practice the magic itself, the wizards, sort of that world's equivalent of the writers and thinkers and the kind of people who've been speaking today, including myself, make a deal with that crack. And the deal is they give up their magic, but in return, they can live forever. And if they are allowed to do that, then they can stay in this world forever. Because on the other side of that crack is death. And in return for immortality, they give up all their gifts. And what they do not understand and come to accept through the course of the book is that the crack is a delusion, because the ability to live forever is unnatural. To stay in the world is a terrible mistake. We have to pass on. And on the other side of the crack is death. But the only way to pass into death is to give up yourself entirely. And for me, that is what would happen in Solitaire. I would cease. I would cease because I would have to let go of the ego attachment to the idea that I know who I am. I would never come out the same person. I don't know that anyone here would. And it's a very Western but understandable idea that we can cling to who we are, that we know ourselves so well, that we're the same person we were yesterday and yesterday and yesterday. But it is not true. We've already heard how memory shifts and bends. We already know that everything we make is reconstructions. We reforge the story of our lives over and over again. I would have to let go of that. I would sit in the room and I would rock and I would touch my arms. I would stroke my hair. I would wait until time itself had passed away. And when it was over, if indeed it ever was over, someone else would walk out of that room. Thank you. You want to talk, or we all?
Man hug.
Oh.
I think actually we could talk, but I think there's no way to top that. So what I think I will do, suggest instead, is that we'll take a 15-minute break, and when we come back, we're going to hear from people who actually have spent time, starting with Breitenbach. So thank you so much, Mike. That was fantastic.
Oh, sure.